My name is Augustus Monroe, and I spent 40 years designing the very subway tunnels that are the veins of New York City. I know every inch, every clearance, every pocket of safety hidden in that roaring darkness. So when my son-in-law Julian, with my own daughter Serena watching, pushed me onto the tracks in front of a speeding train, he thought he was committing the perfect murder. He didn't know he was just sending me home. As the train roared over my head, the wind threatening to tear the clothes from my back, I didn't feel fear. I felt a cold calm and terrible clarity. He had just made the biggest mistake of his life, and I was about to become the ghost that would haunt his every waking moment. Before I tell you how a 75-year-old structural engineer dismantled a Wall Street predator's life from beyond the grave, I would be honored if you would let me know where you're listening to this from in the comments below. And please hit that like and subscribe button if you believe that underestimating the quiet man in the corner is always a mistake. It had all started a week before, in a place that was the complete opposite of a subway tunnel. It was a restaurant in Manhattan, a place so fancy the water glasses were made of crystal and the menu didn't have any prices on it. My son-in-law Julian loved places like this. They were his natural habitat. He was a financial advisor, a man who wore suits that cost more than my first car, and had a smile as bright and as hard as the diamonds in his watch. He had invited me to dinner, he and my daughter Serena, just to celebrate, he'd said. What we were celebrating was never made entirely clear. I sat there in my simple dark suit, a man of concrete and steel, feeling like a misplaced tool in a jewelry box. Julian was in his element, holding court, telling a charming story to the waiter, a story that made the man laugh and then bow with a new level of respect. Julian was a master of that. He could make anyone feel like they were the most important person in the room, all while he was quietly and methodically figuring out what he could take from them. My daughter Serena sat between us. She looked beautiful as she always did, but there was a tension around her eyes, a quiet, pleading look she kept shooting my way when Julian wasn't looking. She was a gentle soul, my Serena, a wild flower I had somehow raised in the concrete jungle of this city, and she had married a wolf, a charming, well-dressed, and utterly ruthless wolf. After the appetizer, a tiny, complicated-looking thing on a plate the size of a saucer, Julian leaned forward, his elbows on the crisp white tablecloth. He lowered his voice, creating a bubble of false intimacy in the loud, clattering restaurant. "Gus," he began, his voice a smooth, confidential purr. "We're family, and as family I have to be honest. I'm worried about you." I took a slow sip of my water. The performance had begun. "I was looking over your portfolio again," he continued, "the one your accountant sent me. And it's good. It's solid. It's exactly what a man of your generation would build. Full of blue-chip stocks, municipal bonds, things that are safe, stable, and completely stagnant." He smiled a smile that was meant to be reassuring, but to me it looked hungry. "You've worked your entire life, Gus. You've built an incredible nest egg. My job as your son-in-law and as a man who loves and respects you is to make that nest egg work for you, to make it grow. The market is in a place right now where with a few aggressive moves I could double your net worth in 18 months. Double it. Think of what that would mean for Serena, for your future grandchildren." He was good. He was so good. He was not talking about greed, he was talking about my legacy. He was not talking about taking my money, he was talking about protecting it, about making it grow for the daughter I loved. Serena was looking at me, her eyes wide with a hopeful, pleading look. She believed him. She had drunk every last drop of his poisoned Kool-Aid. I placed my water glass down on the coaster with a quiet, deliberate click. "Julian," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as the foundations I used to design. "I appreciate the offer, I truly do. You are a brilliant man at what you do. But my wife Esther, may she rest in peace, she and I built that portfolio together. She was the numbers person, I was the structures person, and we built it the same way I would build a bridge, with the strongest materials designed to withstand the worst possible storm, not to win a beauty contest. It is slow, it is steady, and it is safe. I'm not interested in aggressive moves, I am interested in sleeping at night." The charming smile on Julian's face faltered for just a fraction of a second, but I saw it. In its place for a single unguarded instant was a flash of pure, cold, reptilian fury, the look of a predator whose prey has just refused to walk into the trap. Then just as quickly the smile was back, wider and warmer than before. "Of course," he said with a smooth, easy laugh. "Of course. I understand completely. A man has to be comfortable. I just want you to know the offer is always there. For family. He raised his wine glass. To family. I raised my water glass. To family, I echoed. And as our glasses met in the air between us, I felt a cold, hard certainty settle in my gut. This was not over. This was just another failed attempt. And a wolf, when it is hungry, does not simply give up after one failed hunt. It just starts looking for a new and more direct angle of attack. The drive back to my apartment in Brooklyn was a long and quiet one. The glittering, arrogant skyline of Manhattan retreated in my rearview mirror, and the familiar, solid, and unpretentious landscape of my own neighborhood began to take its place. The dinner had been a performance, a carefully staged play, and I had refused to play my part. I could still feel the chill of Julian's smile after I had turned him down, the flash of cold reptilian fury in his eyes before it was masked again by his practiced charm. His words echoed in my head, a smooth, slick, and venomous lullaby. Make that nest egg work for you. For family. He had spoken of our family's future, but all I could hear was the sound of a wolf circling, testing the walls for a way in. And as I drove over the Brooklyn Bridge, the dark water of the East River churning below, another voice, a voice I had not heard in years but knew better than my own, rose up from my memory. It was the voice of my wife, my Esther. The memory came back to me as sharp and as clear as the winter air. It was from about 2 years ago, in the final months of her life, when the cancer had taken her strength but had not touched her mind. Her mind, her brilliant, sharp, and fiercely protective accountant's mind, was as clear as a bell to the very end. We were in our living room, the one that looked out over the small garden she loved, and the coffee table was covered in a mountain of legal documents. Wills, trusts, power of attorney forms. It was the grim, necessary work of a life coming to its orderly conclusion. I was a man adrift in a sea of legal jargon, but Esther was the captain navigating us through the treacherous waters with a calm, steady hand. She was the one who had always handled our finances, who had taken my steady paycheck from the transit authority, and through a lifetime of quiet, brilliant investing, had turned it into a formidable fortune. Now pay attention, Gus. She had said, her voice a little weaker than it used to be, but still full of that sharp, no-nonsense authority I had loved for 50 years. She tapped a thick document with her finger. This is the most important part. This is the trust. The Esther and Augustus Monroe family trust. She explained it to me slowly, patiently. Everything we have, Gus, the portfolio, the properties, it all goes in here. Serena is the sole beneficiary. She will receive the income from it, a generous allowance for the rest of her life. But the principal, the nest egg itself, that is a fortress, and I have designed it to be impenetrable. What do you mean? I had asked. I mean, she said, and her eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, had a hard, protective glint in them, that no one, not even Serena, can touch the principal without a unanimous vote from a 3-person board of trustees. And that board will consist of you as the chairman, our lawyer, and Serena herself. It will take all 3 of you to agree to make any major changes or withdrawals. It is a lock with 3 different keys, and you, my love, will hold the most important one. I remember feeling a little confused. Isn't that a bit complicated? Don't you trust our own daughter? Esther had sighed a long, weary sound. She looked out the window for a moment before answering. I trust our daughter's heart, Gus. It is her judgment I worry about. She had then looked me directly in the eye. It is him I do not trust. Julian. I had been about to protest. Julian at that point was just the charming, handsome man who was making our daughter happy. But Esther held up a hand, silencing me. You are a good man, Augustus Monroe, she said. You see the good in people. You are a builder. You see a solid structure and you trust it. I am an accountant. I look for the cracks. I run the numbers, and his numbers do not add up. He is a man who is in love with the idea of wealth, not with the hard work that it takes to build it. She continued, her voice a low, prophetic whisper. He looks at our daughter, and I do not see a man in love. I see a man who is appraising an asset. He looks at what we have built together, this life, this fortune, and he has an appetite. I can see it in his eyes. She reached out and took my hand, her own feeling so fragile in my strong, calloused one. You and I, Gus, we built this from nothing. Your sweat, my smarts. It is the story of our life together. It is our legacy. Do not, she said, her grip tightening with a surprising strength, Do not ever, for any reason, let a wolf in sheep's clothing manage our legacy. Now sitting in the quiet of my truck, the memory of her words was a chilling echo of the conversation I had just had. Julian's polite, predatory pitch, his desire to manage our legacy, his talk of aggressive moves. It was all there. Esther had diagnosed him with perfect, terrible clarity years ago. I pulled into my garage and cut the engine. Her trust was the fortress she had built to protect our family from the very attack Julian had just attempted. I was not just a stubborn old man refusing a kind offer. I was a guardian standing my post, honoring the last will and testament of the woman I loved. I walked into my quiet apartment and looked at the picture of her on the mantel, her smile as bright and as sharp as I remembered. The dinner had been a test, a probe of my defenses, and I had held the line. A quiet, grim satisfaction settled in my heart, but it was mixed with a new, cold sense of foreboding. I had won this battle. But Julian the Wolf was still circling the walls of the fortress, and I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that he would not give up. He would just start looking for another way in. My firm but polite refusal at that dinner did not end the war. It only ended the first battle. I knew that. A wolf, when it finds the main gate of a fortress barred, does not simply give up and go home. It begins to circle the walls patiently, relentlessly searching for a smaller, unguarded door, a crack in the foundation. And in the fortress that my wife Esther and I had built, there was one such door, a door I had never considered a weakness, a door that had a name, my daughter Serena. I wasn't there, of course, when Julian began his quiet, insidious work. But I have pieced it together since, from legal documents, from my daughter's own tearful, fragmented confessions, from the terrible clarity of hindsight. I can see the scene as if I had been a ghost in the corner of the room. It would have been a few nights after our dinner. Julian would be in his home office, a sleek, minimalist space of glass and steel that overlooked the glittering, heartless expanse of the city. He would be surrounded by the financial documents I had, in a moment of misguided transparency, allowed him to see. And he would be seething with a cold, impotent fury. He would be looking at the documents for the Esther and Augustus Monroe family trust, and he would be seeing nothing but locked doors. He would see the ironclad clauses my wife, my brilliant, far-sighted Esther, had put in place. He would see the 3-person board of trustees, a board on which I held the deciding vote. He would see that the vast majority of our life's work, the nest egg he so desperately wanted to get his hands on, was a fortress he could not breach. He could see the treasure, but he could not touch it. He would have been about to give up, to toss the papers aside in frustration, and then he would have seen it. A separate, thinner file, a document that was not part of the trust, a simple, straightforward policy statement, my life insurance policy. It was a substantial one, the kind a man who has spent his life working on dangerous construction sites takes out to protect his family. A policy for $2 million. And the sole beneficiary listed in clear, simple type was my only child, Serena Monroe Vance. And unlike the trust, this was not a fortress. This was a direct, simple transaction. Upon my death, a check for $2 million would be handed directly to my daughter. No board of trustees, no complicated clauses, just a clean, simple, and life-altering sum of money. And I can see the look on his face in that moment. The slow, predatory smile that would have spread across his lips. He had found it, the unguarded door. He no longer needed to break into the fortress. All he had to do was remove the man who held the keys. The plan, the terrible final plan, would have been born in that quiet, expensive office under the cold, glittering lights of the city. But first he had to prepare the ground. He had to isolate me. He had to turn my own daughter's love for me into a weapon he could use against me. The next weekend, he would have made his move. He would have approached Serena not with anger or with pressure, but with a performance of deep, loving concern. "Honey," he would have begun, his voice a soft, worried purr. "Can I talk to you about something? It's about your dad. I'm a little worried about him." He would have her full, undivided, and loving attention. "I so admire his independence," Julian would say, choosing his words with a surgeon's precision. "But his financial strategy, it's so outdated. It's almost reckless. He's letting your inheritance, your future, just sit there gathering dust in those old low-yield bonds. It's not safe." And then he would deliver the first subtle and poisonous cut. "And you know I was looking at his life insurance policy, And it's a wonderful, generous thing that he has you as the beneficiary. But don't you think it's a little strange? He trusts you with $2 million upon his death, but he doesn't trust you or us to help him manage his investments while he's alive. He would let that thought hang in the air, a seed of doubt. It's like he would continue, his voice full of a fake sympathetic sadness. He's saying he trusts you to be a wealthy widow, but he doesn't trust you to be a smart, capable partner. It feels like he doesn't see you as an adult Serena. He still sees you as a little girl who can't be trusted with the family legacy. He trusts a lawyer on a board more than he trusts his own daughter. And that just doesn't feel right to me. It feels like a lack of respect for you. It was a brilliant and diabolical piece of manipulation. He had taken my act of protection, the fortress my wife and I had built to keep her safe, and he had reframed it as a personal insult to her. He was not attacking me. He was defending her honor against her own father's supposed lack of trust. Serena, my dear, sweet, and sometimes insecure Serena, who had spent her life trying to prove herself in a world of powerful men like Julian and me, would have been stung by that. "He's just careful, Julian," she would have said, a defensive note in her voice. "He's from a different generation." "I know," Julian would say, putting a comforting arm around her. "And I love him for it. I just hate the thought of him not seeing the brilliant, capable woman I see, the woman who is my partner. It hurts me that he doesn't trust you the way I do." And the seed was planted. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the change. Our phone calls, once so easy and warm, were now a little more strained. She started asking questions, strange, probing questions about the trust, about the board, about my financial strategy. They were her words, but they had the cold, hard ring of his logic. A small, almost imperceptible wall was being built between us, and I, in my foolish fatherly love, thought it was just a passing phase, a young woman trying to understand the family finances. I had no idea that I was listening to the sound of my own executioner patiently and methodically sharpening his blade. The memory of my wife's warning was a cold, constant companion in the days that followed my dinner with Julian. Her words, "a wolf in sheep's clothing," echoed in the quiet of my apartment. I had successfully defended the fortress of our shared fortune, the trust she had so brilliantly constructed. But her other warning, the one I had not paid enough attention to, was about the cracks in a person's character. I had seen the cracks in Julian, but I was beginning to fear with a deep and sickening dread that the real weakness, the real point of entry for the wolf, was in the foundation of my own daughter's soul. The distance between Serena and me, which had been a small, almost imperceptible hairline fracture, now felt like a chasm. Our phone calls were brief and strained. The easy warmth was gone, replaced by a polite, formal coolness on her end. I could hear Julian's coaching in her every word, his smooth corporate language of assets and growth, now a part of her vocabulary. He was not just her husband, he was her tutor, and he was teaching her to see the world and her own father through his cold, calculating eyes. I felt like I was losing her, a slow, painful erosion of the daughter I had known. And then one evening she called, and her voice was different. The cool professional tone was gone. In its place was the voice of the little girl I remembered, a voice that was soft, sad, and full of a trembling vulnerability. "Daddy," she began, her voice a little choked as if she had been crying. "It's me." A father's heart is a foolish, hopeful thing. In that single moment, all my suspicion, all my cold, hard analysis, it all just melted away, replaced by an immediate primal wave of concern. "Serena, baby girl, what's wrong? Are you okay?" I heard her take a shaky breath. "No, Daddy," she whispered. "I'm not. I've been a terrible daughter." The words were a quiet, devastating confession. "I've been so caught up in all of this," she said, a wave of her hand gesturing, I imagined, at the expensive, impersonal apartment she now called home. "In Julian's world. And I've let it get between us. I've been distant, and I've been cold. And I am so sorry." I was speechless. This was the conversation I had been dreaming of, the breakthrough I had been praying for. "Julian and I were talking," she continued, and for the first time the mention of his name did not put me on high alert. "And he was the one who made me see it. He told me, 'Serena, your father is a great man. Don't let our life, our success, make you forget where you came from. He's worried about us, Daddy. He wants us to be a real family. It was a performance. A brilliant, masterful, and diabolical performance. Julian the wolf was now playing the part of the wise, compassionate shepherd, gently guiding his lost lamb back to her father, and I, in my desperate fatherly hope, was ready to believe it. "I miss you, Daddy," she said, her voice now full of a soft, pleading warmth. "I miss us, the way we used to be. And I was thinking, maybe this weekend, the three of us, maybe we could just take a walk like we used to when I was a little girl. No talk about money, no talk about business. Just us, to heal, to reconnect, to be a family again." The offer was everything I wanted to hear, a chance to get my daughter back to repair the growing rift between us. "Of course, baby girl," I said, my own voice thick with an emotion I could not hide. "Of course. Anything." "Oh, thank you, Daddy," she said, her voice full of a relief that sounded so genuine it brought tears to my own eyes. Julian had a great idea. There's an old open-air market downtown he read about near the City Hall station. He thought it would be fun, something different. We could meet at the station on the downtown platform maybe around noon on Saturday, and we can just walk from there. It would mean the world to me. The City Hall station. I repeated, a small, almost imperceptible flicker of unease touching me for the first time. It was an odd choice. A busy central station, but the specific platform for the downtown local on a Saturday afternoon was often quiet, almost deserted between the main rush hours. Why meet there? Why not just meet at the market? But I pushed the thought away. It was the suspicion of an old, overprotective man. She was trying. Julian was trying. This was an olive branch, and I had to take it. To refuse would be to prove their every unspoken criticism of me right, that I was a stubborn, difficult old man stuck in my ways. "Saturday at noon," I said, my voice full of a warmth I was now forcing. "I'll be there." When we hung up the phone, I felt a surge of a hope so powerful it was almost painful. Maybe I had been wrong about Julian. Maybe his love for my daughter was real, and it was changing him. Maybe my wife in her sickness had been overly cynical. Maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. But later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the engineer in me, the man who understood structures and stress points and the hidden weaknesses in things, could not let it go. The City Hall station, the downtown local platform. It was an old station, one of the first in the city. A station I had helped to retrofit myself 20 years ago. I knew its layout intimately. I knew the curve of the track as it came out of the tunnel. I knew the width of the platform. And I knew how the wind, a powerful sucking gust, always preceded the arrival of the express train on the adjacent track. A cold, inexplicable chill ran down my spine. The feeling of a man who has just been given a beautiful, intricate blueprint, but who cannot shake the feeling that there is a fatal and intentional flaw hidden somewhere deep in the design. The hope I had felt after my daughter's phone call was a fragile, foolish thing, and it did not survive long in the harsh light of day. As Saturday approached, a deep and profound sense of unease settled over me. The entire plan, the walk, the specific subway station, it felt wrong. It was a poorly constructed design, and as an engineer, I knew that a bad design is just a disaster waiting to happen. But she was my daughter. She had said she was sorry. She had asked me to come. And a father's love is a powerful and often a foolish form of gravity. I had to go. The City Hall station on a Saturday afternoon was a study in contrasts. The grand Guastavino-tiled arches of the old decommissioned platform were a testament to a forgotten elegance, while the functional graffiti-scarred platform for the downtown local was a place of pure modern utility. As I had predicted, it was quiet, almost deserted. A few tourists were taking pictures of the old architecture. A lone musician was playing a sad, soulful tune on a saxophone, and at the far end of the platform, they were waiting, Serena and Julian. They stood together, a perfect, handsome couple. As I approached, Julian's face broke into that familiar, dazzling smile. "Gus," he said, his voice booming with a false heartiness. "You made it. We were so excited." Serena, however, was not smiling. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed and full of a nervous, agitated energy. She looked like a defendant about to hear a verdict. She gave me a quick, awkward hug that felt more like a collision. The pretense of a friendly walk to a market lasted for about 30 seconds. So the market is just a few blocks from here. Serena began, her voice a little too high, but Julian cut her off, his charming smile still in place, but his eyes as cold and as hard as steel. He was holding a leather briefcase. "Actually, Gus," he said, "before we go, I was hoping we could just clear the air, finalize that little piece of family business we were talking about." He opened the briefcase and took out a sheaf of papers and a pen. I looked at the documents. They were thick with legal language, but I knew what they were. They were the papers that would give him control. "Julian," I said, my voice low and steady, "we have already had this conversation. My answer is no. The answer will always be no." The smile on his face vanished. The performance was over. "Listen to me, old man." He hissed, his voice a low, venomous thing. "I have been patient. I have been respectful. But my patience is at an end. Your daughter, my wife, deserves to have her future secured. Your money is rotting in those pathetic low-yield bonds. It is a waste. It is a sign of your own incompetence. My finances are my own business," I said, my own anger beginning to smolder. "Not anymore," he snapped. "When you become a part of my family, your business becomes my business. You are a roadblock, Gus. A stubborn, sentimental old fool who is standing in the way of your own daughter's happiness." "Daddy, please," Serena said, her voice a pathetic, tearing whisper. She was crying now, the tears streaming down her face. "Please, just listen to him. Just sign the papers. You're tearing this family apart." Her words, her choice of sides, were the final fatal blow. She was not a victim in this. She was his accomplice. In the distance I heard it, a low, familiar rumble, a vibration that I could feel in the soles of my shoes. The express train on the adjacent track was approaching. The sound grew a roaring, angry beast coming through the tunnel. Julian heard it too. A new terrible light entered his eyes, a look of sudden opportunistic calculation. The air on the platform began to move, the first gust of wind being pushed ahead of the train, a foul, hot breath from the city's lungs. "Sign the papers, old man," he yelled, his voice rising above the growing roar of the train. "You just have to sign the papers." I looked at my daughter's tear-streaked face. I looked at his, a mask of pure, ugly greed, and I felt a profound and weary sense of defeat. "This conversation," I said, my voice tired, "is over." I turned my back on them, a final gesture of dismissal, and I intended to walk away. But as I turned, I saw it. A flicker of movement, not from Julian, from my daughter. He looked at her, a quick, sharp, questioning glance. "And Serena, my daughter, the little girl," I had raised the wildflower. She looked at the roaring, dark mouth of the tunnel, then back at her husband, and she gave him a single, almost imperceptible and utterly damning nod. It was my death warrant. I felt the hands on my back. 2 of them, hard. A sudden, violent, and completely unexpected shove. I am a 75-year-old man. I had no time to brace myself. My center of gravity was gone. The world tilted, a dizzying, sickening lurch of concrete and dirty tile. I saw my daughter's horrified but resolute face for a fraction of a second. The roar of the train was a physical, deafening wall of sound. The air was torn from my lungs, and then I was falling. The hard, unforgiving edge of the platform scraped against my side, and then there was nothing but air and the horrifying close-up view of the tracks, the gravel, and the 2 blinding white-hot lights of the train rushing towards me like the eyes of God. The world did not fade to black. It became a chaotic, tumbling kaleidoscope of grimy, tile-blurred lights and the horrifying close-up reality of steel and gravel. The shove from Julian was not a clumsy, angry push. It was a calculated, efficient act of violence, a 2-handed, full-body thrust that launched my 75-year-old body into the void with the force of a catapult. My last image of the world above was my daughter Serena's face, a mask of tear-streaked, horrified, and yet undeniable complicity. She had given the nod. She had sanctioned my death. The air was torn from my lungs. The roar of the approaching train, which had been a loud external sound, was now an all-consuming internal roar, a physical presence that vibrated in my teeth, in my very bones. I hit the gravel bed between the tracks with a force that sent a searing white-hot shock of pain through my side and my shoulder. For a fraction of a second, the animal instinct, the pure primal terror, took over. My body wanted to curl into a ball, to scream, to simply wait for the inevitable crushing end. But then another part of me, a part that was older and deeper than the fear, took control. It was the engineer. The man who had spent 40 years of his life in these tunnels. The man who had walked these very tracks in the dead of night inspecting welds and measuring clearances. My body in its terror saw only death. But my mind, in a flash of cold, clear, and professional lucidity, saw a blueprint. I knew this stretch of track. I had overseen its refurbishment in the late 90s. I knew the exact specifications of the rolling stock that used it, and I knew with the absolute certainty of a man who had designed the very thing that was about to kill him that there was a space, a trough, a safety pocket between the rails designed for workers to lie in if they were caught unawares. It was a gap of precisely 22 inches from the gravel bed to the undercarriage of the train. It was a coffin built into the heart of the machine, and it was my only chance. In the single eternal second before the train was upon me, I did not panic. I acted. I used the pain, the adrenaline, and the last of my strength to execute a single, desperate, and perfectly calculated maneuver. I did not try to get up. I rolled. I rolled hard onto my stomach, forcing my body into the shallow, gravel-filled depression between the two steel rails. I flattened myself, my face pressed into the grimy, oil-soaked stones, my hands covering my head. I made myself as small, as flat as humanly possible. I made myself a part of the blueprint. And then the world ended. The roar became a physical, crushing weight, a solid wall of sound that was not just heard, but felt. The ground beneath me did not just shake. It became a living, violent thing, a beast trying to buck me off. The first blast of wind hit me like a solid object, a hot, foul breath that smelled of ozone, hot metal, and the city's deepest, darkest secrets. It tore at my clothes, trying to lift me, to pull me into the screaming, grinding metal just inches above my back. I clung to the gravel, my fingers digging into the stones, every muscle in my body screaming in protest. And then the train was over me. It was not a single passing thing. It was an eternity of thunder. An endless, deafening procession of steel wheels, of grinding brakes, of 1,000 tons of metal screaming past at 50 miles per hour just a hand's breadth from my skull. The noise was so absolute, it was a form of silence, a pure white noise that obliterated all thought, all feeling, all hope. I was not a man anymore. I was just a vibration, a piece of matter enduring an impossible force. I kept my eyes shut tight, but the flickering strobing lights from under the carriages burned through my eyelids, a chaotic, terrifying light show. And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The roar receded, replaced by the high-pitched squeal of the train's brakes as it pulled into the station further down the platform. The violent wind died down, leaving a swirling eddy of dust and grit in its wake. The ground stopped shaking. Silence, a profound ringing and beautiful silence, rushed in to fill the void. I lay there for a long moment, my body a single throbbing symphony of pain. But I was alive. I could feel the sharp gravel against my cheek. I could smell the lingering scent of hot steel. I was alive. I slowly, carefully pushed myself up onto my elbows. The pain in my shoulder was a sharp stabbing thing, but it was the most welcome pain I had ever felt. I looked up, and I saw them. They were standing at the edge of the platform, looking down, their forms silhouetted against the dim station lights. They were looking at the spot where they thought my body would be, a mangled, unrecognizable heap. And then I saw their faces. And what I saw was the final true death of the father I used to be. They were not horrified. They were not panicked. They were not even looking around to see if there were any witnesses. They were smiling. My daughter Serena had a small, tight, relieved smile on her face. And my son-in-law Julian was beaming a broad, triumphant, and utterly monstrous grin of a man who has just closed the most profitable deal of his life. They looked down at my presumed grave, and they were happy. They stood there for a moment longer, savoring their victory. Then Julian put his arm around my daughter's shoulders, a gesture of shared dark complicity. They turned, and without a single backward glance, they walked away, their footsteps echoing in the quiet station. They walked away, leaving me for dead. I waited until their footsteps had faded completely, and then with a slow, deliberate movement that was fueled by a new and terrible energy, I began to get up. The pain was immense, but it was a distant thing now, an inconvenience. It was overshadowed by a new feeling, a feeling of cold, clear, and absolute purpose. I got to my feet. I stood in the trough, in the space that had saved me a ghost in my own grave. I calmly, and with a hand that was now perfectly steady, dusted off my clothes. My suit was torn, my body was a landscape of new and agonizing pain. But my mind was a perfect, silent, and beautifully calibrated machine. The engineer was back in control. They had thought they were closing a deal. They had thought they were committing a murder. But what they had really done was something far, far worse. They had just declared war on a man who had designed the battlefield. And I, Augustus Monroe, was about to become the most terrifying ghost this city had ever known. The roar of the departing train was the sound of my old life leaving the station for good. I lay there in the grimy trough between the tracks, the air thick with the smell of hot metal and ozone, and I listened until the sound was just a faint rumble in the distance. The pain in my shoulder and my side was a sharp, insistent fire, but my mind was a place of absolute cold clarity. I was alive, and they thought I was dead. I pushed myself up slowly, my body a symphony of agony. I looked up at the platform. It was empty. They were gone. My daughter Serena and her wolf Julian had looked down at my presumed grave, smiled at their good fortune, and had simply walked away to begin their new, wealthier life. They had left me for dead without a second thought. My first instinct, the instinct of a law-abiding citizen, a man who believed in systems and in order, was to climb back onto that platform and find a police officer, to report the crime, attempted murder. I could picture the scene, the skeptical faces of the detectives, my wild, unbelievable story of being pushed, and then their story. Julian, the charming, grieving son-in-law, his face a mask of sorrow. Serena, my own daughter, her eyes full of tears, telling them how her poor old and perhaps confused father had been distraught, how he had spoken of wanting to see his late wife, how he had in a moment of tragic despair simply jumped. It would be my word against theirs. A grieving family against a confused old man who had miraculously survived. And I, a student of how the world works, knew exactly whose story they would believe. Lying there in the dirt and the grime of the world I had helped to build, I realized the gift they had given me. It was not the gift of a quick death. It was the gift of a second life, a life where I was a ghost, a life where they, in their arrogance and their grief, would drop their guard completely. They believed their only obstacle was gone. They did not know that the obstacle had just become invisible. A man cannot fight an enemy he cannot see. The decision was made in that instant. I would not report the crime. I would not announce my survival. I would grant their wish. To the world, Augustus Monroe, retired structural engineer, was dead, and in his place, a ghost would rise, a ghost with a blueprint of the city in his head and a cold, hard, and methodical desire for justice in his heart. I did not climb back onto the platform at the City Hall station. That was now a crime scene, my crime scene. Instead, I used the knowledge that had saved my life. I knew these tunnels better than I knew my own home. I found a small unmarked service ladder at the end of the platform, a ladder I myself had inspected decades ago, and I climbed down into the maintenance passage that ran alongside the tracks. I walked in the darkness, the pain in my side, a dull rhythmic throb, until I reached the next station a few blocks north. I emerged from a service exit onto a busy street, just another old man in a torn and dirty suit blinking in the afternoon sun. I was a ghost, and I was already learning how to haunt the world of the living. My first stop was a bank, not for a loan, for a withdrawal. My wife, my brilliant and always prepared Esther, had been an accountant who had seen the worst of human nature. Gus, she had always told me, life is about structures, and sometimes structures fail. You always need a go bag. Our go bag was not a bag at all. It was a separate unlisted bank account with a high daily withdrawal limit funded for just one purpose, an emergency of a magnitude we could not predict. The day the world ends, she used to call it. I walked up to the ATM, my movements stiff, and I withdrew the maximum amount, a thick, reassuring stack of $100 bills. My world had ended, and Esther, even from beyond the grave, was still taking care of me. With the cash in my pocket, I disappeared into the vast anonymous ocean of New York City. I took a cab to a part of Queens. I barely knew a neighborhood of low-slung brick buildings and 1,000 different languages spoken on the street. I found what I was looking for, a small, cash-only boarding house, a place where the landlord looked at my torn suit and my bruised face with a complete and total lack of curiosity. He just wanted the week's rent in advance. I was a man with no name, no history, and no questions. I was the perfect tenant. The room was small, and the bed was hard, and the pain in my body was a constant burning fire. But my mind was clear. My mind was a quiet, orderly workshop. The first few days were a waiting game. I bought a cheap, untraceable burner phone. I bought stacks of every newspaper the city printed. I sat in my small, lonely room and I read. I scanned the pages looking for the news of my own death. And I thought. I grieved not for myself, but for the daughter I had lost, the little girl who had given a nod to sanction her own father's murder. The love I had for her, a vast and unconditional thing, had finally and irrevocably died on those subway tracks. It had been replaced by something colder, something harder, a sense of a profound and terrible duty. I was no longer her father. I was her consequence. On the third day I found it. It was not on the front page. It was a small, insignificant article buried deep in the Metro section of the Daily News, next to an ad for a discount furniture store. The headline was simple: Tragedy at City Hall Station. I read the words, my heart a slow, steady drum. An unidentified elderly man is presumed dead after reportedly jumping in front of an R train on Saturday afternoon. Police say no foul play is suspected. Witnesses, including the man's distraught daughter and son-in-law who had been with him moments before the incident, reported that he had been deeply depressed and despondent in recent weeks. The family has requested privacy at this difficult time. I read the article twice, then a third time. Distraught, depressed, despondent. They had already built their lie a perfect airtight story of a tragic suicide. They were not just murderers, they were architects of a false history. I carefully folded the newspaper and placed it on the small table beside my bed. The world now believed I was gone. My daughter and her husband believed they were free. They believed they were rich. They were celebrating. They had no idea that the man they had just buried in the pages of the newspaper was sitting in a small room in Queens reading his own obituary. The ghost was officially born. The game was afoot. I picked up my new anonymous burner phone. My hands were perfectly steady. I scrolled to the single number I had programmed into it. The number of the only man I could trust. The number of my oldest friend, Leroy Roy Washington, a man who had spent 30 years as an NYPD detective. The time for waiting was over. The time for haunting had begun. I pressed the call button. The small, grimy room in Queens was my tomb and my cocoon. For 3 days I did not leave. I let the pain in my body settle the deep, ugly bruises on my side and shoulder, turning a dark, angry purple. But the physical pain was a distant, unimportant thing. My mind was a silent, focused engine. I read the news of my own death over and over, the short, dismissive paragraph that officially erased me from the world. Unidentified elderly man, presumed dead. No foul play is suspected. They had crafted their lie with a cold and efficient brutality. I was a ghost now. A ghost with a lifetime of savings, a deep and intimate knowledge of the city's hidden infrastructure, and a single, all-consuming purpose: justice. But a ghost cannot act alone. A ghost needs an anchor in the world of the living. A ghost needs an ally. I only had one name on my list: Leroy Roy Washington. We had been friends for 50 years, since we were two young, ambitious black men trying to make our way in a city that was not always welcoming. I had built the city's tunnels. He had policed its streets. He was a retired NYPD detective, a man as cynical and as street-smart as I was methodical and quiet. He was the only man on earth who I knew would understand. I took the burner phone, my hand steady, and I dialed the number I knew by heart. He answered on the second ring, his voice the same old gravelly, impatient bark it had been for half a century. Yeah, what? I couldn't just say, "It's Gus." A dead man was calling him. It had to be right. I reached back into our shared history, to a foolish bet we had made as young men. "Roy," I said, my voice a low, quiet thing. "It's Gus. I'm calling about that beer I owe you, from the '68 Dodgers game." The silence on the other end was absolute. I could picture him in his own quiet apartment, his brow furrowed in a mixture of confusion and anger. "Who is this?" he finally growled, his voice a low, dangerous thing. "This isn't a funny joke. My friend Gus is dead. I was just talking to his son-in-law yesterday, helping with the arrangements." The words were a fresh stab of pain. Julian, the grieving son-in-law, already playing his part, already wrapping my own friends into his web of lies. "It's not a joke, Roy. I said, my voice quiet but firm. I need you to listen to me. Do you remember the night my Esther passed? You were the one who sat with me in the hospital waiting room, and you told me a story about your first partner, about a case in the Bronx to keep my mind off things. You told me the brand of cigarettes he smoked and the name of the dog he left behind. I repeated the names back to him, a secret shared between two men in a moment of profound grief. Another silence, longer this time. I could hear his sharp, ragged intake of breath. He knew. No one else on earth could have known that story. My God, he whispered, his voice stripped of all its anger, now just a thin, reedy sound of pure, uncomprehending shock. Gus, is that really you? But how? They said you jumped. They lied, Roy, I said. It's a long story. I need to see you. Alone. Where? He asked, the detective in him already taking over. When are you safe? I'm safe, I said. Meet me at sunrise, the old pier in Red Hook, the one where we used to fish as kids. Come alone. I ended the call before he could ask any more questions. The next morning, as the first faint light of dawn was turning the gray waters of the harbor to a pale, milky pink, I saw his familiar hulking figure walking down the deserted pier. He looked older than I remembered, the years having carved deeper lines into his already craggy face. He saw me, a lone figure sitting at the end of the pier, and he stopped, his whole body going still. He was looking at a ghost. He walked the rest of the way slowly, his old cop's eyes scanning everything, his hand never far from his jacket pocket. Gus, he said, his voice a rough, disbelieving whisper as he finally stood before me. In the flesh. More or less, I said, my voice a dry rustle. We didn't embrace. We just stood there for a moment, two old men on a cold pier with a lifetime of friendship and an impossible story hanging in the air between us. Tell me, he finally said, his voice a low command. Tell me everything, from the beginning. And so I did. I told him about the dinner, about Julian's predatory pitch for my money. I told him about my wife Esther's ironclad trust, the fortress she had built around our legacy. I told him about Julian's discovery of the life insurance policy, the unguarded door. I told him about Serena's phone call, her voice full of a false, practiced sorrow luring me to that subway station. And then I told him about the platform. I told him about the argument, about Julian's mask of charm finally dropping to reveal the ugly, greedy snarl underneath. I told him about Serena's tears, her pleas for me to just sign the papers. And then I told him the hardest part, the part that was a cold, dead weight in my own soul. I told him about the nod, the small, almost imperceptible nod from my own daughter that had been my death warrant. Roy listened, his face a mask of stone. He was a man who had spent 30 years listening to the worst stories the city had to offer, and his face gave away nothing. But I saw the muscles in his jaw clench, a small, hard knot of a deep and growing anger. I told him about the push, about the fall, about the cold professional clarity that had saved my life as I rolled into the safety trough I had helped design. I told him about the eternity of thunder as the train passed over me, and then I told him what I had seen when I looked up. I told him about their smiles, the relieved, happy smile on my daughter's face, and the broad, triumphant, monstrous grin of her husband. That was the moment the mask on Roy's face finally broke. A low, guttural sound, a sound of pure, undiluted rage escaped his lips. That son of a bitch, he growled. I finished the story, the faked news report, my disappearance, my new life as a ghost in a small room in Queens. When I was done, a heavy silence settled over the pier, broken only by the cry of a lone seagull. Roy stared out at the water for a long time, his mind the sharp, analytical mind of a detective processing every detail. So let me get this straight, he finally said, turning to face me, his eyes now cold and hard as steel. They tried to kill you. They failed because you are a smarter man than they could ever comprehend. They think you're dead, and they are at this very moment in the process of cashing in a multi-million-dollar life insurance policy on the man they just tried to murder. I nodded. And you, he continued, a new dangerous light in his eyes. You didn't call the police because you know it's your word against theirs. You want more than just a trial you might lose. You want to dismantle them. You want to turn their lives into the nightmare they thought they had just escaped. "I want justice, Roy," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "The kind they understand. I want to take away the very thing they were willing to kill me for. I want to leave them with nothing but the truth of what they are." Roy looked at me, his old friend, a man he thought he knew, a man who had just revealed a core of iron he had never suspected. A slow, grim, and terrible smile spread across his face. "Okay, Gus," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial growl. "Okay, you're a ghost, and I've always been good at helping ghosts settle their unfinished business." He clapped a heavy hand on my good shoulder. "Welcome back from the dead, my friend. Now, tell me what you need." The meeting on that cold, windswept pier was a pact, a declaration of a silent and secret war. When Roy and I shook hands, it was not just a greeting between old friends. It was the formation of an alliance. He was a man who had spent his life bringing criminals to justice. And I, for the first time in my life, was a man who was willing to operate outside the law to achieve it. Roy, with his 30 years of NYPD experience, knew that a ghost cannot haunt from the street. A ghost needs a lair, a place to rest, to plan to become invisible. He didn't take me to a hotel. He took me to a place he knew from his old days on the Force, a small, forgotten corner of the city. We took 3 different cabs, a classic piece of his old-school tradecraft, to a nondescript pre-war walk-up in Inwood, a neighborhood at the far northern tip of Manhattan, a place so far from Julian's glittering midtown world that it might as well have been on the moon. The apartment was on the top floor of a 5-story building with no elevator. The climb up those stairs was a slow, agonizing journey, every step a fresh reminder of the deep, ugly bruises on my side. But the pain was a good thing. It was a reminder of why I was here. The room itself was sparse, almost monastic. A simple bed, a small table, a single chair, and a window that looked out not onto a grand skyline, but onto a quiet, anonymous courtyard. It was perfect. It was a place where a dead man could be invisible. "No one will look for you here," Roy had said, his voice a low, gravelly thing. "The landlord is a friend. He thinks you're a distant cousin of mine, a writer who needs a quiet place to finish a book. You pay in cash, you keep to yourself, and you cease to exist." For the next few days, that room was my entire world. Roy was my only link to the outside. He became my hands and my feet. He brought me groceries in plain brown bags. He brought me a change of clothes, simple, anonymous things that would not draw a second glance. He brought me a first aid kit, and I tended to my own injuries in the quiet of the small bathroom, the angry purple of the bruises, a stark and constant reminder of my daughter's final terrible nod. And he brought me the tools of my new trade. He arrived one evening with a heavy duffel bag. Inside was not a set of wrenches or a level. It was a high-powered, completely untraceable laptop, its serial numbers scrubbed. He brought 3 different burner phones still in their plastic wrappers. He brought a set of encrypted hard drives. "In my day," he said as he set up the computer on the small table, "if you wanted to know a man's secrets, you sat in a car across the street from his house with a long lens and a bad cup of coffee. You followed his car, you listened to his garbage. It was a physical game." He plugged in the laptop and its screen glowed to life, a bright, empty rectangle in the dim room. "Now," he said, his voice a low growl, "the game is different. Now you follow the data, and you make damn sure you don't leave a trail of your own. This machine is a ghost. It doesn't exist, which means the man using it doesn't exist either." The room was no longer a prison. It was a command center, a war room. When Roy left that night, I sat down in front of the humming, glowing screen. The pain in my body was a distant, unimportant thing. The grief in my heart was a cold, hard stone that had become my new source of strength. The ghost was no longer just hiding. He was ready to begin the haunting. My battlefield was no longer the physical world of concrete and steel. It was the digital world, a place of invisible structures of data, streams of firewalls and backdoors. And I, an engineer, approached it not as a hacker, but as a builder. Every system I knew has a blueprint, and every blueprint, if you look long and hard enough, has a flaw. Julian's life, his entire financial empire, was a system, and I was going to find its flaws. I started with the public information, the open source intelligence that Roy had taught me about. I became a scholar of Julian Vance. I read every article ever written about him, every fawning profile in business magazines, every press release his company had ever issued. I scoured his social media and his wife's, building a detailed and intricate map of their lives, their connections, their habits, their ambitions. I was building a blueprint of my target. And then I began to look for a way in. I was not a hacker. I did not know how to write code or break through complex encryption, but I was an engineer. I knew that the strongest fortress is only as strong as its weakest door, and often the weakest door is the one the builders themselves leave open. I focused on Julian's company on the secure client portal he used to communicate with his wealthy investors. I did not try to attack the portal itself. I began to research the small third-party tech company that had designed it. I spent days on the dark corners of the internet searching for technical manuals for developer forums for old forgotten strings of code, and then I found it. A post from 4 years ago on a forum for web developers complaining about that very company. The post mentioned a universal administrator password, a backdoor that the developers had built into the system for maintenance, a backdoor they had, in their arrogance, forgotten to remove in the later versions. My heart was pounding a slow, steady rhythm. I navigated to the portal's login page. I went to the administrator access panel, a page that was not linked publicly, and I typed in the simple, stupid, and absurdly arrogant password I had found. Password 1223. I hit enter, and for a moment nothing happened, and then the screen flickered, and I was in. I was not just in an account, I was in the entire system. I had a god's eye view of Julian's entire empire. I could see his client list. I could see his investment strategies. I could see the private fawning messages he sent to his most important clients. And I could see the real numbers, the ones behind the curtain of his confident public statements. I could see the cracks in his foundation. I could see the deals that were built on a house of cards, the stocks he was over-leveraged on the clients who were growing nervous. I sat there in my small, anonymous room in Queens, a ghost with a set of master keys and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. Julian had pushed me into the darkness of the tunnels I knew so well, and now I had just found my way into his. He had no idea I was here. He had no idea I was watching. He had no idea that the man he had left for dead was now standing in the digital heart of his world with a blueprint of his entire life spread out before him. The haunting was about to begin, and I, the engineer, was about to become a demolition expert. The alliance I had forged with my old friend Roy on that cold Red Hook pier was the beginning of my new life as a ghost. He was my anchor to the world I had left behind my eyes and ears in a city that now believed me to be a part of its silent, buried history. While I remained in the anonymous safety of my small room in Queens, a self-imposed prison and a command center, Roy moved through the world that had once been mine, a world that was now preparing to mourn me. A week after my death, Roy came to my apartment. He didn't knock. He had his own key. He walked in his face a mask of grim, tired anger, and he placed a small folded newspaper and a funeral program on my small table. "Your funeral was this morning, Gus," he said, his voice a low, gravelly thing. I went, sat in the back. It was a lovely service. I looked at the program. My own name was printed on the front in an elegant looping script, Augustus Gus Monroe. Below it were the dates of my birth and my death. Seeing it there in black and white was a strange, out-of-body experience. I was officially a historical fact, a closed chapter. How was it? I asked my own voice, a dry, rusty thing. Roy sank into the single, hard-backed chair in the room, a man too big for the small space. It was a performance, he growled. A Broadway-quality performance. Your daughter, Serena. She was the star, dressed in a beautiful, simple black dress, a single perfect tear tracing a path down her cheek as she stood by the casket. She played the part of the heartbroken, orphaned daughter to perfection. Meryl Streep couldn't have done it better. I felt a familiar dull ache in my chest, the ghost of a father's love. "And Julian?" I asked. A look of pure, unadulterated disgust crossed Roy's face. "Him," he spat. "He gave the eulogy, and it was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. I've heard a lot of lies in my 30 years on the force, Gus, but this one was special." Roy leaned forward, his eyes hard. He stood up there, his voice thick with a fake theatrical sorrow, and he talked about you. He called you a man of quiet dignity, a pillar of the community, a devoted father who had given his entire life to his family. He told the story of a man who had suffered a great loss early in life. Roy continued, his voice dripping with a bitter sarcasm, and who had carried that sadness with him, a quiet, noble burden. He talked about your last few weeks, about how you had seemed distant, despondent, lost in the past. He painted a perfect, tragic picture of a good man who had finally succumbed to a lifetime of quiet grief. He didn't just let people believe you had committed suicide, Gus. He sold it to them. He gift-wrapped it. He made them weep for the tragic broken man he himself had created. I just stared at the funeral program at my own name. He had not just tried to kill me. He was now actively and skillfully murdering my memory, replacing the truth of my life with a convenient, pathetic fiction that served his own narrative. He was not just a murderer. He was a historian, a revisionist historian, and his first act was to erase me and build his own monument on the ashes. Serena cried through the whole thing. Roy said, his voice a little softer now. But it was a strange kind of crying. Her eyes were red, but the tears, they didn't seem to fall right. It was like she was an actress who had been told to cry, and so she was crying, but her heart wasn't in it. Or maybe, he added, his voice a low, dark thing, maybe she was crying with relief. We sat in the silence of that small, anonymous room for a long time. The funeral was over. The lie was now the official accepted truth. To the world, I was a tragic, broken man who had taken his own life, and my daughter and her husband were the sad, beautiful, and now very wealthy orphans. The next day, Roy came back. He didn't bring a newspaper this time. He just sat down in the hardback chair, a look of cold, grim finality on his face. Well, he said, he didn't waste any time. What are you talking about? I asked. I made a call, Roy said, to an old friend of mine who works in the fraud division of one of the big insurance carriers. I asked him as a favor to put a quiet flag on your life insurance policy, just to let us know when any activity occurred. And, I prompted, though I already knew the answer. The funeral was yesterday, Gus, Roy said, his voice flat and hard as stone. And this morning at 9 a.m., sharp, less than 24 hours after he was weeping over your empty casket, your son-in-law, Julian Vance, was on the phone with the insurance company. He had the death certificate, he had all the paperwork. He was initiating the claim on your $2 million life insurance policy. There it was, the final undeniable proof. The smoking gun. It had not been an argument that got out of hand. It had not been a moment of passion. It had been a business transaction, a cold, calculated, and efficient move to liquidate an asset. And I was the asset. My death was the final signature on a contract that would make them rich. Any last lingering shred of fatherly pity I had for my daughter, any faint hope that she had just been a weak, terrified accomplice, it all evaporated in that moment. She was not a pawn. She was a partner. She had stood by his side as he pushed me. She had played the grieving daughter at my funeral. And she was, I had no doubt, standing by his side as he made the call to cash in on my death. A new and terrible and profoundly liberating clarity settled over me. I was no longer a father grieving for a daughter he had lost. I was no longer a victim hiding from the people who had tried to kill me. The time for grieving was over. The time for hiding was over. I stood up and walked over to the humming, glowing laptop that Roy had brought me. I sat down in the chair, my back straight, my hands steady. The ghost had finished his mourning. Now it was time for the haunting. Roy looked at me, a question in his eyes. So, what's the first move, Gus? He asked, his voice, a low growl, hungry for the fight. I looked at the blank screen of the computer, a blank canvas for the new and terrible art I was about to create. The first move, I said, my own voice, a quiet, cold, and unfamiliar thing, is to show my son-in-law, the financial genius, that the market can be a very, very haunted place. The funeral was a quiet, formal affair, a final public lie to seal the first chapter of my new existence. Julian's eulogy, a masterpiece of hypocritical sorrow, was the official story the world would now believe. My daughter's perfect theatrical grief was the emotional confirmation. To everyone I had ever known, I was gone. A tragic, sad, and closed case. And in the quiet, anonymous safety of my small room in Queens, the real work, the work of a ghost, was just beginning. My alliance with Roy was the foundation of my new life. He was my hands, my feet, my connection to a world I could no longer touch. But my mind, the mind of an engineer, the mind that had spent a lifetime understanding complex, interconnected systems, that was the weapon. Julian had pushed me into the dark mechanical underworld of the subway, believing it would be my tomb. He did not realize it had always been my kingdom. And now I had found my way into his. The digital tunnels, the invisible structures of his financial empire. and I was about to teach him that a structural weakness, no matter how small, can bring the whole building down. Roy and I sat in my small room, the glow of the laptop screen painting our faces in a pale blue light. "So what's the first move, Ghost?" he had asked, his voice a low, excited growl. "A demolition is not a single grand explosion, Roy," I had replied, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "It is a series of small, precise, and carefully placed charges. We don't start with the main pillar. We start with a load-bearing wall on the second floor, one he doesn't even know is important." Through the access I had gained, I had a complete blueprint of Julian's financial world. I could see every client, every trade, every secret bet he had made. And through Roy's old network of informants and gossips, I had the real-world context. Roy had made a call. He had learned that one of Julian's biggest clients, a notoriously nervous tech billionaire, was secretly looking for an excuse to divest from a pharmaceutical company that Julian had pushed him into heavily. The company was solid, but the billionaire was getting cold feet. All he needed was a small push. "We're going to give him that push," I said. Using an anonymous offshore trading account Roy had helped me set up, I began my work. I didn't make a big splash. I executed a series of small, almost insignificant short sales on that pharmaceutical stock. It was the equivalent of a whisper in a hurricane, a single stone tossed into a raging river. But it was a start. Then Roy made another call to a contact of his, a low-level financial blogger, with a reputation for being the first to report on unsubstantiated rumors. An anonymous tip. A whisper about institutional jitters surrounding the pharmaceutical company. It was nothing. It was a ghost story. But in the nervous, twitchy world of high finance, a ghost story is sometimes all it takes. I can picture the scene in Julian's office the next day. He would have been at his desk, a king surveying his kingdom of glowing green numbers on his multiple screens. And then he would have seen it. A small, unexpected flicker of red. The pharmaceutical stock. It had dipped. Not by much, a few percentage points, but it was a dip he hadn't predicted. He would have frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. He would have called his broker, his voice full of the easy arrogance of a man who believes he is the smartest person in any room. "What's going on with this pharma stock?" he would have asked. "Why is it soft today?" "I don't know, Julian," the broker would have replied, confused himself. "There's no real news, just some stupid rumor on a blog, a little institutional sell-off. It's nothing, just market fluctuation." Market fluctuation. Julian would have accepted that. He was a master of the universe, but even he could not control the irrational whims of the market. He would have felt a prickle of annoyance at the unexpected loss, a loss that had wiped out his gains for the week, but he would have dismissed it. He would have poured himself a glass of his ridiculously expensive scotch, and he would have moved on, confident in his ability to make it all back and more the next day. He had seen the first tiny crack in his foundation, and he had simply arrogantly painted over it. He had no idea that I was the one who had put it there. He had no idea that the demolition had already begun. He was a man who believed he controlled the game. He had no idea that the ghost of the man he thought he had murdered was now quietly, patiently rewriting the rules. The first strike had been a test, a probe of his defenses. The second strike would be a demonstration. It was time to move from a load-bearing wall to something a little closer to the heart of the structure. It was time to target his own money. Roy's work was as always impeccable. His disgruntled journalist contact had been hungry for a story, and Roy had given him one, an anonymous but well-sourced tip. A story not about a company, but about an investor. A story about a major but unnamed fund manager who was rumored to be facing a secret SEC inquiry causing his partners to lose faith. The journalist had run with it, a juicy piece of blind gossip that was just vague enough to be legally safe, but just specific enough to start a fire. The article was published on a popular financial news website. The company that was the target of this rumor was a mid-cap tech firm, a company that was the absolute crown jewel of Julian's personal portfolio. He had bet big on it. He had bet his own fortune on it. As the online forums and chat rooms began to buzz with the rumor, as traders began to whisper, "Who is it? Who's the fund manager in trouble?" I went back to work. This was not a small, subtle series of short sales. This was a massive, aggressive, and anonymous bet against the stock. I was no longer just adding to the whispers. I was screaming into a megaphone. I can see him in his office the next day. The confident, arrogant master of the universe was gone. In his place was a frantic, panicked man, his face a mask of disbelief as he watched the stock ticker for his favorite company turn a deep, bloody, and catastrophic red. The rumor had become a self-fulfilling prophecy. The whispers had become a stampede. The stock was in a freefall. He would have been on the phone yelling, screaming at his brokers to stop the bleeding to buy more to hold the line. But it was too late. The ghost had already done its work. By the time the market closed that day, the stock had dropped over 20%. It was not a small loss. It was a seven-figure blow to his personal wealth, a wound he could not ignore. That night, Julian would have sat alone in his vast, dark office, the glittering skyline of the city, no longer looking like his kingdom, but like a vast, dark forest full of unseen enemies. This was not bad luck. This was not market fluctuation. A targeted hit on his biggest client's stock, and now a catastrophic, rumor-fueled collapse of his own. It felt personal. It felt coordinated. It felt like an attack. He was a man who prided himself on knowing all the players, on seeing all the angles. But this came from nowhere. It was an attack from an invisible enemy, a ghost in the machine. The paranoia, I imagine, would have started to creep in then. He would have looked at his own partners with suspicion, at his rivals, at everyone. He was a man who knew he was being hunted, but he could not see the hunter. The haunting had officially begun, and he had no idea that the ghost who was tormenting him was a quiet 75-year-old man sitting in a small room in Queens, calmly and methodically planning his next move. The first attack, the one on the pharmaceutical stock, was a test. It was a rangefinder, a way to see how Julian would react to a small, unexpected loss. He had reacted with arrogance and annoyance, dismissing it as market fluctuation. He saw it as bad luck, not as an attack. He was a man who believed he was the master of his own universe, a universe that had no room for ghosts. Now it was time to introduce a new, more personal kind of chaos into his orderly world. It was time to stop attacking the market and start attacking his reputation. Roy and I sat in my small, quiet room, the laptop screen a battlefield map between us. I had spent days sifting through the digital guts of Julian's empire, and I had found it. A structural weakness. It was a real estate deal he had put together for a group of his wealthiest clients, a massive commercial development down in the meatpacking district. On the surface, it was a brilliant move, a deal that promised huge returns. But I, a man who had spent his life with blueprints, saw the flaw. And with the access I had, I could see the documents Julian thought were buried. The problem was the zoning variance. The entire project's profitability was dependent on getting a special permit from the city to build 10 stories higher than the current regulations allowed. In his presentations to his clients, Julian had presented this variance as a near certainty, a simple formality. But I had found the private email chain between Julian and his contact at the Department of Buildings, and the formality was anything but. The emails spoke of greased palms, political donations, and a friendly understanding. It was a deal built not on solid ground, but on the shifting sands of city corruption. It was a house of cards, and I had just found the card at the very bottom. "This is it, Roy," I said, pointing to the screen. "This is the one. If this deal goes south, it won't just be a market loss. It will be a loss of faith. His clients will see him not just as unlucky, but as a liar." Roy looked at the emails I had highlighted, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. "Corruption," he said the word, a happy growl. "My favorite. It's so beautifully and reliably human." He stood up and put on his old worn trench coat. "I know a guy," he said. "A reporter over at the Business Journal. A young kid, hungry, and he hates guys like Julian with a passion. Let me see if he's interested in an anonymous tip from a disgruntled source inside the Vance organization." That night, Roy met the reporter, a kid named Sullivan, at an old, dimly lit bar in the West Village, the kind of place that still smelled of stale beer and old secrets. He didn't give him the emails. That would be too direct, too easy to trace. He played the part of an old, retired cop passing on a whisper he'd heard on the street. "I can't give you names, kid," Roy had told him, his voice a low, gravelly murmur. "But if I were you, I'd start digging into that new Vance development in the meatpacking district. Specifically, I'd start looking at the zoning variance application. Ask yourself how a project that's 10 stories over the legal limit is sailing through the approval process so smoothly. Start looking at the political donations made by the partners involved in that LLC. Follow the money. There's a story there, a big one." He had given the kid the thread, and a hungry reporter like a wolf knows what to do with a thread. He pulls. A week passed. The silence from Julian's world was a tense, expectant thing, and then the second charge was detonated. It was not a front-page expose. It was something far more subtle and far more damaging. It was a small single-column article in the Heard on the Street section of the Business Journal buried on page 6. The headline was innocuous, "Questions Raised Over Meatpacking Development." The article itself was a masterpiece of innuendo. It never mentioned Julian by name. It referred only to a high-flying boutique investment firm and its charismatic founder. It spoke of a highly ambitious new development and unusually swift progress through the city's complex zoning board. It quoted anonymous sources within the Department of Buildings who had expressed surprise at the project's easy path. It raised questions about potential conflicts of interest and well-timed political contributions. It accused no one of anything. It just asked the questions. The article was a whisper, not a shout. But in the small, insular, and deeply paranoid world of high-stakes real estate investment, a whisper is often all it takes. I can picture the scene the morning that paper landed on Julian's desk. He would have seen the headline, and his blood would have run cold. He would have read the article, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the page. He would have seen it not as a piece of journalism, but as an attack. A direct and perfectly aimed shot across his bow. He would have thrown the paper across the room, his mind racing, trying to figure out who had betrayed him, who had leaked. Was it someone in his firm, someone at the city, a rival? And then his phone would have rung. It would have been one of his major investors, one of the men whose money was tied up in that very deal. Julian, the man's voice would have been not angry but full of a new and deeply unsettling caution. "I just saw the piece in the Journal this morning. What's this all about? You told me the zoning was a sure thing." Julian, the master performer, would have immediately gone into damage control mode. "It's nothing, Robert," he would have said with a smooth, confident laugh. "It's a hit piece, a jealous competitor trying to sabotage the deal. It's baseless, all smoke and no fire. The project is as solid as a rock. You have my word." And he would have spent the entire day on the phone making the same speech, putting out the fires, reassuring his nervous, wealthy clients. And he would have been successful for the most part. He was a convincing liar. By the end of the day, the immediate crisis would have been contained, but the damage was done. A seed of doubt, a seed of distrust had been planted in the minds of the very men whose faith was the foundation of his entire empire. That night, he would have sat alone in his vast dark office, the glittering skyline of the city, no longer looking like his kingdom, but like a vast dark forest full of unseen enemies. The first attack, the one on the pharmaceutical stock, he had dismissed as bad luck. The second, the one on his own tech portfolio, he had seen as a coordinated market play. But this was different. This was not about numbers. This was about information, a leak. Someone somewhere had access to his secrets. The paranoia, I imagine, would have started to take root then. He would have looked at his own partners with suspicion, at his assistants, at everyone. He was a man who knew he was being hunted, but he could not see the hunter. He was being attacked from the shadows by an invisible and seemingly all-knowing enemy. The haunting was no longer a matter of market forces. It was now a personal and deeply psychological war. And he had no idea that the ghost who was tormenting him was a quiet 75-year-old man sitting in a small room in Queens, calmly and methodically planning his next move. The attacks on Julian's financial empire were precise, methodical, and completely untraceable. I, the ghost in the machine, had wounded him. I had made him bleed millions. But a man like Julian does not bleed out from financial wounds alone. His true lifeblood was his confidence, his unshakable belief in his own superiority, his control over the world. To truly dismantle him, I had to do more than just drain his bank accounts. I had to drain his sanity. I had to make the master of the universe doubt the reality of his own world. I had to become the ghost he did not believe in. The war now shifted from the digital to the psychological. My intimate knowledge of his life, gleaned from months of silent digital observation, became my new battlefield. I knew his schedule better than he did. I knew which car service he used, which table he preferred at his favorite restaurant, the route he walked from his office to the gym. I had the blueprint of his life. And now I was going to introduce a series of structural anomalies of impossible, terrifying glitches into his perfect system. The first sighting was subtle. A ghost should not appear in a flash of lightning and a clap of thunder. A ghost should be a flicker in the corner of your eye, a thing so fleeting you question if you ever saw it at all. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I knew from his calendar that Julian had a meeting on the Upper West Side. I knew the route his car service always took back downtown. I stood on a busy street corner on Columbus Avenue just as the afternoon rush was beginning to swell. I was wearing my old familiar tweed overcoat, the one I had worn for 20 winters, the one my daughter would have recognized from a block away. As his black town car approached the intersection, I simply stepped off the curb and began to cross the street with the crowd. For a single fleeting second, as the car glided past my eyes met his through the tinted window. I did not smile. I did not wave. I just looked at him, my face a blank, impassive mask. And then I was gone, swallowed up by the anonymous river of the New York City crowd. I can only imagine the effect. He would have seen me a jolt of pure, impossible recognition. His heart would have seized in his chest. He would have blinked, and I would have been gone. He would have whipped his head around, searching the crowd, his mind scrambling to process the impossible image, his father-in-law, the dead man, standing on a street corner looking directly at him. He would have told himself it was impossible, that he was tired, stressed, overworked, that the city was full of old black men in tweed coats. It was just a trick of the light, a phantom limb of his own guilt. He would have dismissed it. But the seed of the impossible, the first tiny crack in the foundation of his reality, had been planted. The second move was for my daughter, for Serena. Her grief as performed and as hollow as Roy had described it was still her shield. I needed to remind her that the ghost she was mourning was not at peace. I knew her habits. I knew the small, quiet moments of her life. Roy, my quiet, patient friend, did the work. While she and Julian were out at one of their fancy charity dinners, he had picked the simple lock on their apartment door. He was inside for less than 5 minutes. He did not steal anything. He just left a gift. When Serena came home that night, tired from a long evening of performing the role of the beautiful, tragic widow, she walked into her bedroom. And there on her pillow was a single perfect and long-dead red rose. It was the kind of rose I used to leave on my wife Esther's pillow every year on their anniversary. There was no note. There was no explanation. There was just the impossible, silent, and withered flower, a message from a world she did not want to believe existed. The third charge was for them both. It was designed not just to frighten, but to corrode the very air between them. I knew from Julian's calendar that they had a reservation at a quiet, absurdly expensive French restaurant downtown, a place they went to for anniversaries and big deals. It was the kind of place that prided itself on its quiet, sophisticated ambiance. The kind of place where the only music was the soft, unobtrusive tinkling of a live piano player. Roy had paid a visit to that piano player earlier in the day. $100 bill and a quiet, persuasive word from a retired NYPD detective can be a very powerful tool. I can picture the scene. Julian and Serena would be sitting at their usual corner table, the conversation strained. Julian would be trying to project an aura of calm control, trying to reassure her that the recent market volatility was nothing to worry about. Serena, still shaken by the impossible appearance of the dead rose, would be trying to believe him, but the fear would be there, a cold thing in the pit of her stomach. And then the music would change. The soft, anonymous jazz the pianist had been playing would fade out, and after a moment of silence, a new melody would begin. A quiet, heartbreakingly beautiful, and deeply familiar melody. It was my Althea's favorite piece, a Chopin nocturne, the one I had played for them from the old cassette tapes in my living room in a life that seemed a world away. Julian would have frozen a fork halfway to his mouth. He would have recognized the tune instantly. His eyes would have darted to Serena, and he would have seen the color drain from her face. To him, the music was a strange, unsettling coincidence. But to her, it was a direct communication. The dead rose on her pillow. And now her dead mother's favorite song playing in this random restaurant. It was a message, a sign. Her father was not at peace. He was here. He was watching. She would have started to tremble, the carefully constructed walls of her composure crumbling. "Julian," she would have whispered, her voice a thin, reedy thing. "He's here. I can feel him. He's haunting us." Julian, a man of logic, a man who did not believe in ghosts, would have seen only his wife coming undone, her grief manifesting as a childish, hysterical paranoia. "Don't be ridiculous, Serena," he would have hissed, his voice a low, angry thing, mindful of the other diners. "It's a song. A piano player is playing a song." But his own heart would have been pounding. The old man on the street corner, The whispers about his business deals, the catastrophic losses in the market, and now this impossible, targeted, and deeply personal piece of music. It was not a coincidence. It was a message. The beautiful, expensive dinner would have been ruined. The argument, I'm sure, would have continued all the way home, a toxic mixture of her terrified, superstitious belief and his angry, rationalizing denial. The ghost was no longer just a flicker in the corner of his eye. It was now a sound. It was a presence. It was a question. And it was a wedge being driven slowly and methodically into the heart of their marriage. The haunting was in full swing. And the beautiful, confident couple who had smiled at my grave were now living in a ghost story of their own. A story where every shadow held a shape they recognized, and every quiet melody sounded like a judgment. The psychological war I had been waging against Julian was a slow, methodical demolition. I had cracked his financial foundation with targeted market plays. I had corroded his professional reputation with a well-placed leak to the press. And I had begun to dismantle his sanity with a series of quiet, impossible, and ghostly coincidences. He was a man under siege not from an army he could see, but from a silence he could not understand. He was wounded, paranoid, and bleeding money. He was, in short, desperate. And a desperate man is a predictable man. A desperate man does not look for a safe harbor. He looks for a miracle. And I was about to build him one. Roy and I sat in my small room in Queens, which had become the war room for our silent campaign. The laptop screen was our battlefield. "He's selling off assets to cover his losses," Roy said, his voice a low growl of satisfaction. He had been tracking Julian's movements, both physical and financial. "He's bleeding Gus, but he's not dead yet. His big clients, the ones from the real estate deal, they're nervous, but they haven't pulled out completely. He needs a win. A big, spectacular win to restore their faith and his own." "Then we will give him one," I said, my fingers moving across the keyboard. My new work was not with steel and concrete, but with whispers and lies. I had spent the past week constructing my final, beautiful, and utterly deadly trap. It was a small, obscure, and nearly bankrupt biotech company called Nexus Gene Therapies. They had one product, a highly experimental drug for a rare neurological disorder. Their stock was trading for pennies. They were by all accounts a failure. But I, the ghost, was about to resurrect them. "Roy," I said, "I need your contacts again. Not the hungry kid this time. I need the old respected ones, the ones the serious money listens to. I need you to start a new whisper." The plan was a symphony of deception, and Roy was my conductor. He began to make calls to have quiet lunches to pass on an anonymous tip from a highly placed source within the FDA. The whisper was simple and electrifying. Nexus Gene Therapies had a breakthrough. Their Phase 2 trial results were not just good, they were miraculous. The full data was about to be presented at a major medical conference in 2 weeks, but the insiders were already positioning themselves for a windfall. While Roy was seeding the ground in the real world, I was working in the digital one. I created a dozen anonymous accounts on the financial message boards and chat rooms that I knew Julian obsessively monitored. I began to build a narrative. I became a chorus of different voices, all singing the same song. I was a low-level lab tech at Nexus hinting at unbelievable results. I was a disgruntled employee at a rival firm complaining that Nexus had cracked the code. I was a financial analyst posting a long, detailed, and completely fabricated thesis on why Nexus was the most undervalued stock in the history of the market. I created a groundswell of hype, a perfect artificial storm of excitement. I can picture Julian in his glass office, his world crumbling around him. His clients are calling, their voices full of a new sharp-edged concern. His wife, my daughter, is a ghost in their own apartment, starting at shadows, her nerves completely frayed. He is a man on the edge of an abyss, and then he sees it, a flicker of green on his screen. A small penny stock, Nexus Gene Therapies, is up 20%. He dismisses it. The next day it's up another 40%. He starts to pay attention. He sees the whispers on the message boards, the same ones I had written. He sees a blog post from a respected analyst, an analyst who had been fed the story by Roy's contact. He would have seen it as a sign, a lifeline from the universe. He would have thrown himself into the research, his desperation making him see only what he wanted to see. He would have seen the potential, the miracle drug, the chance to not just recoup his losses, but to multiply his fortune, to silence all the whispers, to prove to his clients, to his wife, to the ghost that was haunting him, that he was still the master of the universe. The final piece of the trap was the insurance money. I knew from a flag Roy's contact had placed the exact day the $2 million check for my death had been deposited into Julian's account. It was blood money. It was the price he had put on my life. And I knew that a man like Julian would not let that money sit idle. It was capital. It was ammunition. The week before the medical conference, the hype I had manufactured reached a fever pitch. The stock was a rocket. Julian was convinced. This was his miracle. I can see him in his office late at night, a bottle of expensive scotch on his desk, his face lit by the glow of his computer screen. I can see him making the decision, the final, fatal act of a desperate gambler. He would have gathered every last penny he had, the money from the assets he had sold, the last of his liquid cash, and the $2 million from my life insurance policy. He would have looked at that number, a fortune that could have secured a comfortable life for him and my daughter forever. And he would have seen it as not enough. His greed, his need to win, to crush the invisible enemy that was haunting him, would have been an all-consuming fire. And then he would have done it. A few clicks of a mouse, a transfer of funds, a single massive all-or-nothing bet. He would have taken the blood money, and he would have placed all of it on the table of my own design. He pushed his entire world into the center of the pot, confident that he held a winning hand. He had no idea that the man sitting across from him, the man he could not see, was the one who had stacked the deck. The bait was taken. The trap was set. All that was left was to spring it. The final phase of the haunting was not a subtle whisper. It was a public execution. I had laid the trap with meticulous care, building a beautiful gilded cage of hope for a man who had none left. Julian, blinded by desperation and greed, had not just walked into the cage. He had slammed the door shut and locked it from the inside. He had bet everything he had, including the $2 million of my blood money, on the miracle stock I had created, Nexus Gene Therapies. Now all that was left was for the floor to fall out. The day of the medical conference arrived. It was the day the world was supposed to learn the full miraculous details of Nexus's new drug. In the week leading up to it, the stock had become a supernova, its price doubling, then tripling, as the hype I had so carefully orchestrated reached a fever pitch. On his computer screen, Julian was no longer just a man recouping his losses. He was a financial genius on the verge of his greatest ever victory. His $2 million bet was now worth $6, then $8, then $10 million on paper. I can picture him in his office, the arrogance returning, the swagger coming back into his step. He had beaten the ghost. He had outsmarted the market. He was the master of the universe once more. He would have called his clients, his voice full of a restored, unshakable confidence. Did you see it, Nexus? I told you. Sometimes you have to have the courage to bet big. He would have been magnanimous in his victory. He would have taken Serena out to a lavish dinner, pouring champagne, telling her their troubles were over, that their perfect life was secure once more. He was a king, surveying his newly reconquered kingdom. The press conference was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Friday morning, just as the market opened. I imagine Julian was in his office before sunrise, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes glued to the pre-market trading, watching his paper fortune tick even higher. This was his coronation day. At 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the press conference was set to begin, Roy made the final move. He wasn't passing a whisper to a blogger this time. He was dropping a bomb. Using an anonymous, encrypted email address, he sent a single document to the lead investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, a man with a reputation for breaking big stories. The document was a work of art, a forgery so perfect it was indistinguishable from the real thing. It was an internal FDA memo complete with official letterhead and the forged but perfectly replicated signature of a mid-level director. The memo was a preliminary finding, and its contents were devastating. It stated that the clinical trial data for Nexus Gene Therapy's new drug showed significant statistical anomalies and indications of potential data manipulation. It recommended an immediate and full investigation. At 8:52 a.m., the Wall Street Journal, after a frantic 8-minute attempt to verify the unverifiable, ran with the story. A single explosive headline hit the wire, sent to every trading desk, every news outlet, every financial institution in the world. WSJ exclusive FDA memo raises serious questions about Nexus Gene Therapy's trial data. The bomb had been detonated. I can see Julian in his office. He would have seen the headline flash across his screen. His heart would have stopped. He would have told himself it was a lie, a last-ditch effort by short sellers to drive the price down before the good news was announced. Hold the line, he would have thought. Just hold on until 9 a.m. But at 8:55 a.m., the Nasdaq, citing the Wall Street Journal report, took an extraordinary step. They halted all trading on Nexus Gene Therapies stock pending clarification of news. The rocket ship had just had its engines shut off in mid-flight. The ticker symbol was frozen, a static, unmoving number on his screen, a symbol of his entire net worth hanging in a terrible silent limbo. The press conference at 9 a.m. was a disaster. The shell-shocked CEO of Nexus, ambushed by the report, was flustered and defensive. He denied everything, but the damage was done. The story was no longer about a miracle drug, it was about a potential fraud. At 9:30 a.m., trading was reopened. And what followed was not a sell-off, it was an extinction-level event. The stock didn't just drop, it evaporated. In the space of 60 seconds, the price fell 99% from over $100 a share to mere pennies, and then it was delisted entirely. Julian would have just sat there in his beautiful glass office and watched. He would have watched as $10 million of his paper fortune, his miracle, his comeback, his entire world was reduced to a value of less than a used car. The blood money was gone. His client's money was gone. Everything was gone. He was no longer a master of the universe. He was no longer a financial genius. He was not even a victim of a ghost. He was just a fool, a man who had been so blinded by his own greed that he had walked open-eyed into a perfectly constructed trap. The silence in his office, I imagine, would have been absolute. The reckoning was complete. All that was left was for the authorities to arrive. The final phase of the haunting was not a subtle whisper, it was a public execution. I had laid the trap with meticulous care, building a beautiful gilded cage of hope for a man who had none left. Julian, blinded by desperation and greed, had not just walked into the cage, he had slammed the door shut and locked it from the inside. He had bet everything he had, including the $2 million of my blood money, on the miracle stock I had created, Nexus Gene Therapies. Now all that was left was for the floor to fall out. The day of the medical conference arrived. It was the day the world was supposed to learn the full miraculous details of Nexus's new drug. In the week leading up to it, the stock had become a supernova, its price doubling then tripling as the hype I had so carefully orchestrated reached a fever pitch. On his computer screen, Julian was no longer just a man recouping his losses. He was a financial genius on the verge of his greatest ever victory. His $2 million bet was now worth $6, then $8, then $10 million on paper. I can picture him in his office, the arrogance returning, the swagger coming back into his step. He had beaten the ghost. He had outsmarted the market. He was the master of the universe once more. He would have called his clients, his voice full of a restored, unshakable confidence. "Did you see it, Nexus? I told you. Sometimes you have to have the courage to bet big." He would have been magnanimous in his victory. He would have taken Serena out to a lavish dinner, pouring champagne, telling her their troubles were over, that their perfect life was secure once more. He was a king surveying his newly reconquered kingdom. The press conference was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a Friday morning, just as the market opened. I imagine Julian was in his office before sunrise, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes glued to the pre-market trading, watching his paper fortune tick even higher. This was his coronation day. At 8:45 a.m., 15 minutes before the press conference was set to begin, Roy made the final move. He wasn't passing a whisper to a blogger this time. He was dropping a bomb. Using an anonymous encrypted email address, he sent a single document to the lead investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, a man with a reputation for breaking big stories. The document was a work of art, a forgery so perfect it was indistinguishable from the real thing. It was an internal FDA memo, complete with official letterhead and the forged but perfectly replicated signature of a mid-level director. The memo was a preliminary finding, and its contents were devastating. It stated that the clinical trial data for Nexus Gene Therapies' new drug showed significant statistical anomalies and indications of potential data manipulation. It recommended an immediate and full investigation. At 8:52 a.m., the Wall Street Journal, after a frantic 8-minute attempt to verify the unverifiable, ran with the story. A single explosive headline hit the wire, sent to every trading desk, every news outlet, every financial institution in the world. WSJ exclusive FDA memo raises serious questions about Nexus Gene Therapies trial data. The bomb had been detonated. I can see Julian in his office. He would have seen the headline flash across his screen. His heart would have stopped. He would have told himself it was a lie, a last-ditch effort by short sellers to drive the price down before the good news was announced. Hold the line, he would have thought. Just hold on until 9 a.m., but at 8:55 a.m. The Nasdaq, citing this Wall Street Journal report, took an extraordinary step. They halted all trading on Nexus Gene Therapy's stock, pending clarification of news. The rocket ship had just had its engines shut off in mid-flight. The ticker symbol was frozen, a static, unmoving number on his screen, a symbol of his entire net worth hanging in a terrible, silent limbo. The press conference at 9 a.m. was a disaster. The shell-shocked CEO of Nexus, ambushed by the report, was flustered and defensive. He denied everything, but the damage was done. The story was no longer about a miracle drug. It was about a potential fraud. At 9:30 a.m., trading was reopened. And what followed was not a sell-off. It was an extinction-level event. The stock didn't just drop, it evaporated. In the space of 60 seconds, the price fell 99% from over $100 a share to mere pennies, and then it was delisted entirely. Julian would have just sat there in his beautiful glass office and watched. He would have watched as $10 million of his paper fortune, his miracle, his comeback, his entire world was reduced to a value of less than a used car. The blood money was gone. His client's money was gone. Everything was gone. He was no longer a master of the universe. He was no longer a financial genius. He was not even a victim of a ghost. He was just a fool, a man who had been so blinded by his own greed that he had walked open-eyed into a perfectly constructed trap. The silence in his office, I imagine, would have been absolute. The reckoning was complete. All that was left was for the authorities to arrive. The collapse of Nexus Gene Therapies was not a quiet private failure. It was a public spectacle, a supernova of financial ruin that sent shockwaves through the market. The business news channels, which had been breathlessly reporting on its miraculous rise just hours before, were now in a feeding frenzy, dissecting its catastrophic fall. The story was everywhere. And in his beautiful, silent, glass-walled office, Julian Vance, the master of the universe, was no longer a king. He was just a man sitting in the dark, watching his own world burn to the ground on a television screen. The silence in his office would have been absolute, a stark contrast to the frantic, screaming chaos inside his own head. $10 million. Gone. Not just lost, but evaporated, turned into digital dust in the space of a few brutal minutes. He would have been numb, I imagine, in a state of shock so profound it was a kind of paralysis. He would have just sat there staring at the frozen ticker symbol, a monument to his own hubris, a tombstone for his own genius. The ghost, the invisible enemy that had been tormenting him for weeks, had won. It had not just wounded him, it had annihilated him. And then the second wave of the attack, the one he could not have possibly predicted, would have begun. The door to his office, the one that led to his outer sanctum of assistants and junior partners, would have burst open, not with a knock, but with the hard, unapologetic force of authority. He would have looked up, his eyes empty and unfocused, to see not his terrified assistant, but 3 men and a woman, all dressed in the plain, functional, dark suits of federal agents. They did not look like his clients. They did not look like his partners. They looked like the end of the world. Julian Vance, the lead agent. A man with a tired, seen-it-all face would have said, his voice a flat official thing that held no room for negotiation. He would have held up a badge and a thick official-looking document. Securities and Exchange Commission. We have a warrant to search these premises and to seize all relevant financial records, digital and physical, in connection with an ongoing investigation into securities fraud, market manipulation, and insider trading. The words, each one a legal hammer blow, would have cut through the fog of Julian's financial shock. This was no longer just about losing money. This was about losing his freedom. The ghost that had haunted his finances was now haunting his liberty. Panic, a raw animal terror, would have finally broken through the numbness. There must be a mistake, he would have stammered, standing up, trying to muster the last tattered shreds of his old commanding presence. I am a respected member of the financial community. My firm is in perfect compliance. This is an outrage. It's a misunderstanding. He was a performer, and even now, with the world collapsing around him, his first instinct was to try and perform his way out of it. The agents would have ignored him. They moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, fanning out through his beautiful, expensive office, their movements a violation of the sacred space of his success. One agent was at his computer, another was pulling files from his cabinets. The woman was speaking quietly but firmly to his terrified staff outside. "Now just wait a minute," Julian would have said, his voice rising, a note of hysteria creeping in. "You can't just come in here and touch my things. I need to call my lawyer." The lead agent would have just looked at him, his expression a mixture of boredom and a deep professional weariness. "You can call whoever you'd like, Mr. Vance," he'd say, "but you will not interfere with this investigation." And then he would have delivered the line that would have finally and truly broken him. "We've received an anonymous but extremely detailed tip, a full accounting of your firm's activities, including the Nexus Gene Therapies stock. We know everything, son. The game is over. We know everything." The words would have hit him with the force of a physical blow. The ghost, the invisible enemy. It was not just a market player, it was someone who was inside, someone who knew his every move, his every secret. He would have slumped back into his chair, the fight draining out of him, a man defeated not just by financial loss but by an omniscience he could not comprehend. The agents were questioning him now, their voices a low, steady drone of official inquiry. They asked about the real estate deal, the one the reporter had written about. They asked about the tech stock that had mysteriously collapsed. And they asked about Nexus, about the massive all-in bet he had made just before its fall. He was a man in a fog, his answers weak, evasive, pathetic. He was trying to build a wall of lies, but he had no mortar left. And it was into this scene, this quiet, clinical demolition of a man's life, that a new figure appeared. The door to the office, which the agents had left open, was filled by the silhouette of a man. An old man. He was dressed in a simple, dark, and slightly old-fashioned suit. He was not a federal agent. He was not a lawyer. He walked into the room slowly, his steps steady, his face calm and unreadable. He walked past the agents, who looked up in confusion, and he stopped in front of Julian's desk. Julian looked up, and his face, which had been a mask of panicked denial, collapsed into a state of pure, uncomprehending, and absolute terror. He looked as if he had just seen a ghost, because he had. "Hello, Julian," I said, my voice a quiet, calm thing that cut through the tension in the room. The lead agent stepped forward, his hand moving towards his jacket. "Sir," he said, his voice a sharp official bark. "This is a restricted area. Who are you?" I did not look at him. I looked only at Julian, at the man who had pushed me onto the tracks, the man who had smiled at my grave. "My name," I said, my voice as cold and as hard as a gravestone, "is Augustus Monroe." The name meant nothing to the agents, but to Julian, it was the sound of the gates of hell opening up. He made a small, choked, gurgling sound, his face a ghastly shade of white. "No," he whispered. You're dead." "Reports of my death," I said, a grim, humorless smile touching my lips for the first time, "were greatly exaggerated." I reached into the inside pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a single folded document. A document I had retrieved from the safe deposit box where my wife had put it for safekeeping so many years ago. I unfolded it and placed it gently on the polished surface of Julian's desk, on top of the pile of useless, losing stock reports. "I believe," I said to the confused and now very interested federal agents, "that you gentlemen might be looking for this." It was a copy of my life insurance policy, $2 million, and pinned to the top, a copy of the claim form filed just one day after my funeral, signed with the confident, arrogant signature of one Julian Vance. The final piece of the puzzle, the checkmate. Julian stared at the paper, then at my face, and the last of his sanity, his denial, his entire world, simply and finally shattered. The document, the copy of my own life insurance policy with Julian's greedy signature on the claim form, lay on the polished desk like a tombstone. Julian stared at it, his face a grotesque mask of terror the color of old parchment. He looked from the paper to my face, his mouth opening and closing silently, a fish drowning in the open air. The man who had a smooth, confident answer for everything was utterly and finally speechless. The lead SEC agent, a man whose face was a study in professional weariness, picked up the document. He read it, his eyebrows rising slightly. He looked at me, a long, appraising look, and then back at the babbling, broken man in the expensive chair. And in that moment, the entire scope of the investigation shifted. This was no longer just a case of a white-collar criminal who had played a dirty game in the market. This was something far older, far darker. "Son of a bitch," the agent muttered under his breath. He turned to his partner. "Get the U.S. Attorney's Office on the line. Tell them the scope of the Vance case has just expanded. We're no longer just looking at securities fraud. We are now looking at conspiracy to commit murder and felony life insurance fraud. The words conspiracy to commit murder were a death knell in the quiet, climate-controlled office. Julian let out a low animal sound, a whimper of pure, abject terror. The last of his composure, his arrogance, his entire persona simply dissolved. "No," he pleaded, his voice a pathetic, childish whine. "No, it's a misunderstanding. He's lying. He's a crazy old man." But no one was listening to him anymore. His performance was over. The lead agent pulled out a pair of handcuffs. "Julian Vance," he said, his voice a flat, official monotone. "You are under arrest." As the cold, hard steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Julian Vance, the master of the universe, simply collapsed. He began to sob loud, ugly, and unrestrained tears of a man who has lost everything and knows he deserves it. They pulled him to his feet, a weeping, broken man in a $1,000 suit, and they began to lead him away. As they passed me, his eyes met mine for a fraction of a second. They were not the eyes of a wolf anymore. They were the eyes of a sniveling, pathetic coyote caught in a trap it never saw coming. I watched them lead him out of the office, out of his empire of glass and lies. My face was a mask of stone. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I felt only the cold, grim satisfaction of a long and complicated and dirty job finally and completely done. My work, however, was not over. There was one last loose end, one last ghost to confront. I walked out of that office building past the flashing lights of the arriving police cars, and I hailed a cab. I gave the driver the address of my son-in-law's apartment, my daughter's home. I let myself in with the key she had given me years ago, a key I had never once used. The apartment was dark, the only light the cold blue flicker of a television screen. She was sitting on the floor in the middle of the vast living room, surrounded by the expensive, soulless furniture she had so carefully chosen. She was just staring at the TV where a financial news channel was showing Julian's face next to a headline that screamed, "Wall Street whiz kid arrested in massive fraud." She didn't hear me come in. She just sat there, a statue of ruin. "Serena?" I said, my voice quiet in the large empty room. She turned her head slowly, as if the movement was a great and terrible effort. And when she saw me standing there in the shadows, her face, which had been a mask of numb despair, contorted into a look of pure, supernatural terror. She scrambled backwards, crab walking away from me on the expensive rug, a low, terrified sound escaping her lips. "No," she whispered. "No, you're not real. You're dead. I saw you. We saw you." She was not looking at her father. She was looking at a ghost, an avenging spirit that had come back from the grave to claim her. "I'm not dead, Serena," I said, my voice heavy with a sorrow so profound it was a physical weight. "But a part of me is. The part that saw you as his little girl, the part that believed you were a good person. That part died on the subway platform." The sound of my real solid voice, not the voice of a spirit, seemed to break her. The terror was replaced by a new and far more terrible reality. I was alive, and if I was alive, then everything they had done, the push, the lie, the insurance claim, it was all known. There was nowhere left to hide. She broke. It was not a slow crumbling. It was a sudden, total, and catastrophic collapse. A sound, a wail of a grief and a guilt so profound it was almost inhuman tore from her throat, and the confession came not in a coherent stream, but in a torrent of broken weeping and pathetic words. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, her body racked with convulsions. "Daddy, I'm so sorry. He said it was the only way. He said you were a roadblock. He said we would be free, we would be happy. I didn't want to. I just closed my eyes. I just nodded. Oh God, Daddy, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." She confessed it all. The plan, the nod, the lie, the performance of the grieving daughter. It all came out a river of poison that had been trapped inside her for weeks. I stood there and I listened to the confession of my own daughter's treachery, and the cold, hard rage I had been carrying, the engine of my entire revenge, simply dissolved. It was replaced by a vast and empty and desolate pity. She was not a monster. She was just a weak and a foolish and a broken thing, a wildflower who had tried to be a wolf and had failed spectacularly. I did not go to her. I did not comfort her. It was not my place anymore. "The police will be here soon, Serena," I said, my voice quiet and empty of all emotion. "They will have questions. All you have left in this world now is the truth. I suggest you use it." I turned and walked out of the apartment, out of the life I had once been a part of. I closed the door on her sobs, on the wreckage of her life. The ghost's work was done. Augustus Monroe, the man, the father, the husband, was all that was left. And it was time to go home. The wheels of justice, once they begin to turn, are a slow and a merciless and an impartial machine. Julian Vance, the architect of his own ruin, was facing a mountain of federal charges that would ensure he would spend the best years of his life in a place without skyline views or champagne service. His fate was sealed. But there was another passenger on his sinking ship, a person whose fate was not so certain, a person whose future now rested in a terrible and ironic twist of fate, entirely in my hands. My daughter Serena. She had confessed. In the terrible quiet aftermath of that wedding night, faced with the undeniable reality of my survival, she had told the police everything, the plan, her part in it, the nod. Her confession combined with my own testimony made the case against Julian a fortress, but it also made a case against her. She was charged, not with attempted murder. Her cooperation and her clear state of manipulation saved her from that. But she was charged with conspiracy to commit wire fraud and insurance fraud. These were serious federal offenses, and the U.S. attorney, a man who was keen to make an example of this high-profile case, was pushing for prison time. And so I was faced with a final and most terrible choice. I was the primary victim, the star witness for the prosecution. My testimony, the raw emotional power of my story, could be the thing that sent my only child, my Serena, to a federal penitentiary for 5 to 10 years. Roy, my good and loyal friend, was clear on his position. "She gave the nod, Gus," he had said to me, his voice a low, hard growl as we sat in my kitchen in the weeks leading up to the sentencing hearing. "She stood there and she watched you fall. She smiled. And then she went to cash the check. The law is the law. She made her bed. Let her lie in it." And the part of me that was a judge, the part that believed in the cold, hard mechanics of cause and effect, agreed with him. She was guilty. Her weakness was not an excuse. Her actions had consequences. But then at night, in the quiet of my own home, the father would emerge, and I would see her not as a co-conspirator, but as the little girl who had once been terrified of the dark, the girl whose tears I had wiped away 1,000 times. I would remember her face in the apartment after the wedding, a mask of such total and pathetic and broken despair. I would think of my wife, my Esther. I would think of her fierce, protective love. Would she have wanted this to see her only child, her beautiful, flawed, and foolish child locked in a cage? I knew the answer. Esther had seen the cracks in our daughter's character. She had seen her weakness, her vulnerability to men like Julian. And she had built a fortress of a trust, not just to protect the money from a man like him, but to protect Serena from herself. She had known her daughter was not a wolf, but a lamb, who was fatally attracted to wolves. And so I made my decision. I was not going to ask the court for revenge. I was going to ask it for a different kind of justice. A father's justice. The day of Serena's sentencing hearing, the courtroom was a quiet, somber place. She sat at the defendant's table, a small, diminished figure in a simple gray dress. The arrogant, beautiful woman from the wedding was gone, replaced by a pale, terrified ghost. When my name was called to give a victim's impact statement, a hush fell over the room. I walked slowly to the witness stand. I did not look at my daughter. I looked only at the judge, a woman about my own age with tired, intelligent eyes. "Your Honor," I began, my voice a low, steady thing. "The facts of this case are not in dispute. My son-in-law, Julian Vance, is a monster, a predator who tried to have me killed for money. And my daughter, in a moment of profound and terrible weakness, stood by and let him do it. She is guilty. Of that there is no doubt." I saw Serena flinch, her shoulders slumping in on themselves. But I continued, my voice now taking on a different tone, the tone of a historian, a man explaining the context of an event. "To understand my daughter's crime, you must understand the man who led her to it. Julian Vance was not just a criminal, he was an artist of manipulation. He found the hollow places in a person's soul, and he filled them with a beautiful and a deadly poison. My daughter, for all her intelligence, has a hollow place, a need for an approval, for a perfect life that has been her undoing since she was a little girl." I then told the story, not just the story of the crime, but the story of the seduction. I told the court about Julian's relentless pressure, about the way he had twisted my own love and protection into an insult against her. I described his character, his charisma, his complete and total lack of a moral compass. "He did not just push me onto those subway tracks, Your Honor," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "He had been pushing my daughter for years towards a moral and ethical cliff, and on that terrible day, in that terrible moment, she finally fell. She is guilty of falling, but he is the one who pushed." I finally allowed myself to look at my daughter. She was looking at me, her face a mask of shame and a new dawning and profound gratitude. "My daughter has lost everything," I said to the judge, my voice a father's plea. "Her husband, her reputation, her self-respect, her life is in ashes. To send her to prison now would not be justice. It would be a final and an unnecessary act of destruction. I am the victim of this crime, and I am asking this court not for vengeance. I am asking for mercy. I am asking you to give my daughter, my foolish and my broken daughter, a chance to rebuild a life not in a prison cell, but on a new foundation of honesty and remorse." I finished. A deep silence filled the courtroom. The judge looked at me for a long, long time, and then she looked at my daughter, and I saw in the judge's eyes a flicker of something, a sad and a weary and a human understanding. The sentence, when it came, was a gift. Serena was found guilty on all counts, but the judge said, taking the extraordinary testimony of the primary victim into account, the court was suspending the prison sentence. Instead, she was sentenced to 5 years of supervised probation, 1,000 hours of community service, and mandatory psychological counseling. My daughter, my Serena, bowed her head on the table and she wept. Not the tears of a performer, but the quiet, cleansing tears of a woman who has just been pulled back from the edge of an abyss. She had not been absolved, but she had been given a second chance. A chance to find her way out of the wreckage. A chance to one day perhaps become the woman her mother had always hoped she would be. The justice system, for all its flaws, is a powerful and a final thing. It took Julian Vance with all his charm and his clever lies, and it ground him into dust. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for a list of crimes so long it was almost impressive: conspiracy to commit fraud, wire fraud. And after my own testimony, the charge that sealed his fate: attempted murder for financial gain. His name, once a rising star on Wall Street, was now just a number in the Bureau of Prisons. He was gone, a problem solved. But the wreckage he left behind was not so easily cleared away. My daughter Serena was the other survivor of that shipwreck, and her journey was in many ways far more complicated than mine. The trial had been a public humiliation for her, a final, brutal stripping away of every lie she had ever told herself. My testimony, the act of a father asking for mercy instead of vengeance, had saved her from prison. But it had left her in a different kind of cage, a cage of shame, of guilt, and of a profound and terrifying freedom. For the first time in her life, she had no one to tell her who to be. The months that followed were a time of silence. I did not call her. She did not call me. The chasm between us was too vast, the wound too raw for easy words. I gave her the space she needed, the space to confront the person she had become, the person who had given that terrible final nod on the subway platform. I did not know if I would ever see her again. I did not know if I even wanted to. And then one cool autumn afternoon, almost a year after the day she had tried to have me killed, I heard a quiet, hesitant knock on my apartment door. I opened it, and there she was. The woman standing in my hallway was not the daughter I remembered. The expensive designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple, anonymous jeans and a plain gray sweater. The perfect salon-styled hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her face was thin, and there were new lines of exhaustion around her eyes. But the hard, ambitious, and calculating glint was gone. In its place was a quiet, somber stillness, the look of a person who has been to the bottom and has somehow impossibly begun the long, slow climb back up. She was not holding a gift. She was not holding anything. Her hands were empty. "Daddy," she said, her voice a small, fragile thing I had not heard since she was a little girl. Can I come in just for a minute?" I was silent for a long moment. A war of 1,000 different emotions raged inside me. The father wanted to pull her into a hug. The judge wanted to close the door. The engineer simply stood there assessing the damaged structure in front of him, wondering if it could ever be repaired. I finally just stepped aside and held the door open. She walked into my living room, the one she had once considered so small and so dated, and she looked around as if seeing it for the first time. She did not sit down. She just stood in the middle of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, a penitent in a holy place. "I've been talking to someone," she began, her voice a low, unsteady whisper. "A therapist. The court made me go at first, but I kept going, 3 times a week. We've been digging, trying to understand. Why I did what I did." She looked at me, then her eyes full of a raw, unflinching honesty that was more shocking than any of her old lies. "There's no excuse, Daddy. I want you to know that. There is no excuse. But there is a reason. The hollowness, the need to be seen to be perfect, the fear of not being enough. Julian didn't create that in me. He just found it, and he used it." She took a shaky breath. "I'm doing my community service," she continued, "at a soup kitchen downtown. The court hours were finished months ago, but I kept going. I go every Saturday. I serve food to people who are really truly in need, people who are invisible, and I listen to their stories." She looked down at her own hands, which were no longer perfectly manicured, but were the hands of a person who worked. It's grounding. It's the first real thing I think I have ever done in my entire life." She was not making excuses. She was not asking for pity. She was simply reporting. She was showing me her work, the slow, hard, and ugly work of rebuilding a soul from the ground up. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears, but her voice was steady. "I know that I do not deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I may never deserve it, and I am not here to ask for it. I just wanted you to see. I wanted you to know that I am trying. I am trying to be a person that my mother would not have been ashamed of." I stood there listening to the daughter I had lost, and in her place, I saw a stranger. A new person, a woman I did not know, a woman who was taking the first tentative and terrifying steps on a long road to redemption. The old foundation of our relationship, the one of father and daughter, of protector and protected, was gone forever, destroyed on that subway platform. But as I looked at her, at the quiet, humbled, and honest woman who stood before me, I felt a new and an impossibly fragile feeling. It was not the old easy love. It was a new and a difficult and a tentative respect. She had not asked for forgiveness, but in that moment she had laid the first single solitary brick of a new foundation. It was not a bridge across the chasm between us. Not yet. It was just a starting point, a place to begin the slow and the painful and the necessary work of building something new on the ruins of the old. The wheels of justice, once they begin to turn, are a slow and a merciless and an impartial machine. Julian Vance, the architect of his own ruin, was facing a mountain of federal charges that would ensure he would spend the best years of his life in a place without skyline views or champagne service. His fate was sealed, but the wreckage he left behind was not so easily cleared away. My daughter Serena was the other survivor of that shipwreck, and her journey was in many ways far more complicated than mine. The trial had been a public humiliation for her, a final brutal stripping away of every lie she had ever told herself. My testimony, the act of a father asking for mercy instead of vengeance, had saved her from prison, but it had left her in a different kind of cage, a cage of shame, of guilt, and of a profound and terrifying freedom. For the first time in her life, she had no one to tell her who to be. The months that followed were a time of silence. I did not call her. She did not call me. The chasm between us was too vast, the wound too raw for easy words. I gave her the space she needed, the space to confront the person she had become, the person who had given that terrible final nod on the subway platform. I did not know if I would ever see her again. I did not know if I even wanted to. And then one cool autumn afternoon, almost a year after the day she had tried to have me killed, I heard a quiet, hesitant knock on my apartment door. I opened it, and there she was. The woman standing in my hallway was not the daughter I remembered. The expensive designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple, anonymous jeans and a plain gray sweater. Her face was thin, and there were new lines of exhaustion around her eyes, but the hard, ambitious, and calculating glint was gone. In its place was a quiet, somber stillness, the look of a person who has been to the bottom and has somehow impossibly begun the long, slow climb back up. She was not holding a gift. Her hands were empty. "Daddy," she said, her voice a small, fragile thing I had not heard since she was a little girl. Can I come in just for a minute?" I was silent for a long moment. A war of 1,000 different emotions raged inside me. The father wanted to pull her into a hug. The judge wanted to close the door. The engineer simply stood there, assessing the damaged structure in front of him, wondering if it could ever be repaired. I finally just stepped aside and held the door open. She walked into my living room, the one she had once considered so small and so dated, and she looked around as if seeing it for the first time. She did not sit down. She just stood in the middle of the room, her hands clasped in front of her, a penitent in a holy place. "I've been talking to someone," she began, her voice a low, unsteady whisper. "A therapist. The court made me go at first, but I kept going. 3 times a week we've been digging, trying to understand why I did what I did." She looked at me, then her eyes full of a raw, unflinching honesty that was more shocking than any of her old lies. "There's no excuse, Daddy. I want you to know that. There is no excuse. But there is a reason. The hollowness. The need to be seen to be perfect. The fear of not being enough. Julian didn't create that in me. He just found it. And he used it." She took a shaky breath. "I'm doing my community service," she continued, "at a soup kitchen downtown. The court hours were finished months ago, but I kept going. I go every Saturday. I serve food to people who are really, truly in need, people who are invisible, and I listen to their stories." She looked down at her own hands, which were no longer perfectly manicured, but were the hands of a person who worked. It's grounding. It's the first real thing I think I have ever done in my entire life." She was not making excuses. She was not asking for pity. She was simply reporting. She was showing me her work, the slow, hard, and ugly work of rebuilding a soul from the ground up. Finally, she looked at me, her eyes brimming with tears, but her voice was steady. "I know that I do not deserve your forgiveness," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I may never deserve it. And I am not here to ask for it. I just wanted you to see. I wanted you to know that I am trying. I am trying to be a person that my mother would not have been ashamed of." I stood there listening to the daughter I had lost, and in her place, I saw a stranger, a new person, a woman I did not know, a woman who was taking the first tentative and terrifying steps on a long road to redemption. The old foundation of our relationship, the one of father and daughter, of protector and protected, was gone, forever destroyed on that subway platform. But as I looked at her, at the quiet, humbled, and honest woman who stood before me, I felt a new and an impossibly fragile feeling. It was not the old easy love. It was a new and a difficult and a tentative respect. She had not asked for forgiveness. But in that moment she had laid the first single solitary brick of a new foundation. It was not a bridge across the chasm between us. Not yet. It was just a starting point. A place to begin the slow and the painful and the necessary work of building something new on the ruins of the old. The final act of the legal drama was the recovery of the insurance money. Julian, in his desperation, had invested the $2 million in the fraudulent biotech stock, and it had been wiped out. But because the funds were so clearly and directly linked to his criminal activity, the government was able to seize assets from his other hidden accounts to repay the insurance company. And the insurance company, in turn, with the case now a matter of public record, had no choice but to pay the claim to its rightful and now very much alive beneficiary, me. One morning, a check for $2 million arrived in my mailbox. It was a strange and a terrible and a heavy thing to hold. It was not a lottery ticket. It was not a reward. It was a price tag. It was the value a man had placed on my life. It was blood money, and I could not keep it. It felt tainted, poisoned by the very crime that had brought it back to me. To spend it on myself on a comfortable retirement would have felt like a final, grotesque victory for Julian. For weeks, the check sat on my kitchen table, a constant silent reminder of the ugliness of the world. And then one quiet evening, as I was looking at the picture of my wife, my Esther, on the mantel, I knew what I had to do. Esther was a woman of numbers of balance sheets, of a fierce and unwavering belief in order. She believed that every debt must be paid and every wrong must be righted. Her life's work had been to create order out of the chaos of the financial world. And Julian's crime had been a profound act of disorder, an attack not just on me, but on the very principles she had lived by. The money was not mine to keep. It was hers. It was her legacy. And I would use it to honor her in the only way that mattered, by restoring a small piece of the order that men like Julian were so determined to destroy. I called Roy and I called my lawyer, and we began a new project, a new act of construction. It was not a bridge of steel and concrete, but a structure of hope. We established a foundation. We called it the Esther Monroe Foundation for Financial Justice. Its mission was simple, and it was the perfect embodiment of my wife's spirit. It was a fund designed to provide pro bono legal and accounting services to the elderly, to the vulnerable, to the people who were so often the targets of sophisticated financial predators like Julian. It was a shield for the defenseless, a weapon for the weak. The foundation's opening was not a grand, lavish affair. It was a small, quiet gathering in a rented office space with a few reporters, a few city officials, and a few of the first people the foundation would be helping. Roy was there, standing beside me, his face a mask of gruff, proud satisfaction. I stood up to say a few words. I looked out at the small crowd, and in the back of the room I saw her. Serena. She had come uninvited. She was not there for the cameras. She was just there, a quiet, humble volunteer ready to help serve coffee. Our eyes met for a moment, and in her gaze I saw not a plea for forgiveness, but a quiet and a profound and a shared understanding. My wife Esther, I began, my voice clear and steady, was a woman who believed in balance. She believed that for every act of destruction there must be an equal and opposite act of creation. A few months ago, my family was the victim of a terrible act of financial violence. Today, with this foundation, we begin the act of creation. As I spoke, a profound sense of peace, a peace I had not known since before that terrible day on the subway platform, settled over me. The ghost was gone. The anger was gone. The need for revenge was gone. They had all been replaced by something better. Purpose. Julian had tried to end my life for $2 million. He had failed. And now that same $2 million would be used to fund a lifetime of justice against men exactly like him. It was a beautiful and a perfect and a final irony. It was the kind of elegant, balanced equation that my Esther, my brilliant and my loving accountant, would have appreciated. The haunting was over. The building had begun, and my life and her legacy had finally and truly been restored. For years I built a city's foundations, believing that a strong structure could withstand any storm. My daughter and her husband taught me that the most dangerous cracks are not in concrete but in character. They pushed me into the darkness, but they forgot I was the one who helped build it. I survived not for revenge, but for justice. I learned that you cannot truly bury a man who knows how to navigate the tunnels, and that the brightest light is not the one you see, but the one you create from the deepest darkness. Do you believe that true justice sometimes requires you to become a ghost in your own story? I would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that a person's greatest strength is often hidden in plain sight, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories.